Good morning, Kevin. Can we check your audio? Let's just ensure that Kevin's audio is okay. Kevs, is your audio okay? Parang hindi na namin marinig ah. Okay, so there's a message from Kevin, so I think we can start. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. We're very happy that you could join us for the third day of our lecture series, and we're delighted to have the first panel with us today on Indigenous peoples and development. So our speakers are here now, and I'm going to turn it over to Kit Barry, who will moderate the session.
Thank you, Dean Leah. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the morning session of day 3 of our lecture series entitled IPRA at 24, Charting Developments in Philippine Indigenous Rights, part of the College of Social Sciences goal to deepen our engagement on Indigenous peoples' rights in the Philippines. The event is organized through the CSS Lecture Series Committee in collaboration with the Cordillera Study Center, Museo Cordillera, and UPB Kasarian. My name is Khadeeja Barry. I'm an instructor from the Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and Psychology here at CSS. And I'm honored to be your moderator for this morning's session alongside my co-moderators, Verna Bautista and Mayumi Teves. I'd also like to thank the Systems Network Office for helping us organize this morning's session. This morning, we'll be examining Indigenous peoples' rights and development with the help of 3 incredible speakers. We're keeping it quite close to home this morning, as one of our speakers is a professor at the college and 2 are actually our own alumni from the BAS program. I'm excited for you all to meet them and hear their insights as we explore the dimension of development and IP rights. It's my honor to introduce our first speaker. MAILEENITA PEñalba is an assistant professor in political science at the Department of Economics and Political Science, University of the Philippines, Baguio. Her research interests include Indigenous studies, urban resilience, democratic citizenship, and local governance. She's currently pursuing a study on citizen competence and Indigenous peoples at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Mamai, we're so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Kit. Mai, just call me Mai. So good morning. I would like to share my screen with you now. It's working. There. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I've just been telling the people earlier in the group that it's a little bit nerve-wracking for me because this is the first crowd that I'm going to interact with in months now. I've been in isolation for quite a while here in New Zealand, and this is actually quite thrilling to be actually talking to a lot of people for the first time in months. So this is also the first time that I'm presenting via Zoom. So I probably need some, learning curve. So my presentation is about citizen competence and Indigenous peoples. This is part of my dissertation. And this is a work in progress. I'm actually almost done with the full draft of my dissertation, but I can share with you uh, some of the elements of my dissertation that I think fit with the theme for today, which is Indigenous peoples and development. Specifically, in my presentation, political development or political participation. So as an introduction, I would like to give you a quick background on why I decided to study citizen competence, what's problematic about citizen competence, what it is, and then how I intend to study it in a multicultural setting using the Indigenous peoples. So just to give you a brief background, about 10 years ago, I did a study on FPIC for my master's degree. So my thesis is about the free and prior informed consent. I went through the FPIC process under the old guidelines, the 2006. I traced the development of the concept from international law to Philippine law, how it was implemented. And my study revealed that no matter how good the policy is, even if we have the best infrastructure to actually implement the free and prior informed consent. And I've heard the discussion the other day about FPIC. It's very intense. What I discovered is that um, in order to implement FPIC successfully, we have to develop the the competence of those citizens that are supposed to make use of this instrument, the Indigenous peoples. And so I shifted my study away from consent into the realm of citizen competence because I believe that all the instruments that we have, the laws that we have, may be futile if the citizens do not have the competence to actually use them fully. So that's the personal reason why I did study citizen competence. Now, I also wanted to talk to you about the state of knowledge in my field of study, citizen competence, by associating it with multiculturalism policies, IPRA in particular, and looking at it in a multicultural setting, which is the Philippines. So multicultural, and in order to do this, I have devised these three grounding concepts. I wanted to look at Indigenous peoples from Cordillera, Northern Philippines. I wanted to specifically look at IPRA and all its attached policies and guidelines. And I wanted to understand citizen competence using the concept of indigenous citizenship. So multiculturalism policies, just to give you a brief background, are policies that are established to manage and accommodate diversity. Through multiculturalism policies, there is an opportunity for marginalized peoples to enact their citizenship more fully and more competently given their increased political and economic resources. For Indigenous peoples, these policies are necessary as special remedies for the deliberate, systematic, and long-term violations of their rights. These remedies, as Kimlicka argues, will help restore a group to its rightful status and strength. So it's very important that we enact these policies because we owe indigenous peoples this at least to restore them to their status and strength, rightful status and strength. These can mean indigenous peoples having access to and control of their ancestral lands, and also having the ability to conduct their lives in accordance with their customary norms and traditions, among others. My project is therefore built on an understanding that IPRA aims to develop citizen competence. As a researcher, I have studied several elements of IPRA, from the NCIP as an institution that's tasked to implement IPRA, to free and prior informed consent. I have done some studies about indigenous people's registration of births, lives, deaths, practices, so many specific elements of IPRA. But this time I wanted to look at it holistically and frame it within the ideal to develop citizen competence among indigenous peoples. Multiculturalism policies such as religious accommodations, regional autonomy, and the recognition of priority rights, land tenure, and right to self-determination are especially important in the context of multi-ethnic Philippines, because these multiculturalism policies combine cultural recognition, economic redistribution, and political participation. They may effectively unquote, that they may effectively promote empowerment of ethnic minorities without threatening state authority or undermining national identity. These policies can potentially improve IP's competence as citizens, yet most research on multiculturalism and citizen competence do not focus on this. And this is the gap that I wanted to address by doing this research. I believe that the area where multiculturalism and citizen competence meet is actually a very fertile ground for social science research. So I have read IPRA so many times, but for this project, I specifically had to read it comprehensively. And what I discovered is that the IPRA is incredible in the sense that it provides the blueprint or roadmap for developing citizen competence. There are many elements in it that actually all lead to this, to the development of citizen competence. Well, the general goal, of course, is to promote and protect and advance the rights of indigenous peoples, but that is very difficult to measure or to study. So I needed to get a concept that I can actually bring to the ground and in a way test and evaluate so that I can help improve theorizing on the notion of citizen competence. IPRA also incredibly covers multiple dimensions of competence that are not commonly addressed by other conceptions of citizen competence that tend to be so narrow focused. So in terms of citizen competence, there are many other concepts that are related to it. And I would like to give you a brief state of knowledge in this field. The first one is about political knowledge. So citizen competence is usually associated with political knowledge. Knowledge is actually the most common proxy of citizen competence. The idea here is that the more knowledgeable you are about politics, the more competent you are as a citizen. And the thing is that most scholars believe that there is a deep and widespread political ignorance among most citizens, as evidenced by decades of research. And this is all over the world. So the average citizen, they say, is politically ignorant. And so the question is, how do we make the politically ignorant competent as citizens? And what does it mean to be a competent citizen? Now, political knowledge comes in the picture because there is a correlation between level of education and political competence. And so the dominant approach to studying citizen competence is to take ignorance, add information or knowledge, you gain competence. It's a simple and it's a linear kind of approach that that posits that we can cure ignorance or address ignorance by simply adding knowledge to the individual. But we know now that that's not really the case. Even with so much information available on the internet, elsewhere, it's actually very difficult to say that a citizen is politically competent. Also, the problem in using this approach is that the standards are heavily focused on national level politics, and very, very little focus is given on local level politics. So it may be unfair for someone with very good knowledge of local affairs to be deemed as incompetent just because this person does not know national level politics. He or she does not know the president or the senators, or cannot name the, the organizational structure of the Philippine government. But if you ask this person about local affairs, he or she is well versed, yet that person may still be deemed as less politically competent. So that focus on national level politics is actually quite unfair. Also, the standards of competence usually use more of the verbal knowledge than visual language. So it does not capture illiterate people or people who are less educated, who, for instance, store knowledge visually. They may not know the name of their president and senators, but they can pinpoint them. If you show them pictures, they will know that these are the politicians that are actually handling political affairs in their country. So it also does not capture that kind of knowledge. The other concept is political sophistication. And this refers to the capacity to develop cognitive complexity or political expertise. Now, what is problematic about this? The thing is that it is very difficult to actually develop political expertise on every political issue. There's so much fake news out there. Even the most educated among us can fall prey to fake news because they are just so well crafted and they seem almost, true or accurate. The thing about political sophistication is that for a person to be deemed competent, that person must show ability to retain and organize a quantity of information or knowledge and deploy them to make capable decisions and actions. But we can only probably do it in one issue, say whatever issue is close to your heart, poverty or gender or environment, but not in all issues that are afflicting our society. And the next is civic virtue. So this includes being tolerant and law-abiding, having the capacity to forge a sense of common purpose, engaging in public discourse. It also means having a sincere commitment to the welfare of others. It means treating others honestly and fairly, and having empathic understanding that is acquired through love, affection, friendship, neighborliness, and the like. The problem is that most scholars actually observe a decline of citizenship, especially in big cities, where your neighbor is actually an anonymous stranger. We don't know who's living beside us. And with the pandemic, of course, we are becoming more and more isolated. So that whole idea of being part of the community and being civil to one another is also somehow in decline. We see this very prominently in the way that people interact online. The loss of civility is just astounding. And it seems like nurturing civic virtue is becoming harder and harder these days. So in terms of definitions of competence, I would also like to give you some definitions of competence depending on the type of democracy that we are studying. So for instance, in direct democracy, the task of the individual is to make decisions on ballot measures. And competence means the capacity to justify political decisions with policy-related arguments. Say, for instance, we have to decide about an issue, euthanasia or legalization of marijuana or legalization of abortion. How do we make a decision about that? A competent citizen, by definition, is someone who can justify his or her political preference in these policy-related issues. If we are in a representative democracy, The task of the average citizen ranges from voting for representatives to participating in a wide array of other civic functions. So basically, in a representative democracy, at the very least, at the minimum, the person should have the ability to choose among alternative political parties and candidates during elections. It means we have to participate in elections. How many times do we vote? Have we voted? Do we vote regularly every 3 years or every 6 years? And do we scrutinize our political candidates so that we hopefully can make the best judgment of who among them can best represent our interests? So that is the measure of competence in a representative democracy, where the primary task of the citizen is to vote or choose between competing political parties and candidates. And finally, in deliberative democracy, the task of the average citizen is to settle differences, form agreements, or collective decisions. So competence here means the ability to discuss political issues actively and do so in an intellectually vigorous and morally legitimate way. So this is a more, in a way, heavy and complex definition of competence, because it is related to not only having the ability to decide, but the ability to debate and the ability to articulately form an opinion and try to convince others that this opinion is the more informed vis-a-vis the others. So this is citizen competence in a deliberative democracy setting. Now, if we are to look at the factors that affect competence, these are also less studied in competence literature because they are hard to study. The fact that it has already been established that the level of education is a critical factor in developing citizen competence. A lot of scholarship has been devoted to the study of political knowledge, level of education, and competence. And most of them actually do not look at the political environment as both an informer and motivator for developing citizen competence. And also individual resource. What is the resources available to the individual in terms of probably money or connections or cognitive abilities that facilitate or hinder the development of citizen competence? So here is how I have devised my framework for studying citizen competence. Given all this, I wanted to introduce an indigenous and local, not national focus in competence research and theorizing. I wanted to look at the lived experiences of indigenous peoples and veer away from a national understanding and the national measure or standard of competence, and look at how indigenous peoples activate their citizenship at the local level. Two, I wanted to identify and analyze the factors that promote or hinder citizen competence within the context of multiculturalism. That's why I have chosen the Cordillera as a site. And three, I wanted to construct a more nuanced theory of citizen competence informed by voices and experiences of the marginalized. In this case, the indigenous peoples of Cordillera, as they have been affected by the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act and its associated policies and guidelines. So I did field work in the Cordillera in 2019. That sounds so long ago, when everybody can still travel and ride on the bus and go on and on and on. So I visited all these provinces and did key informant interviews. What's interesting about the Cordillera is that the indigenous peoples here are dominant in local politics, while in the rest of the Philippines, indigenous peoples rarely occupy positions of power. So that I found really interesting, and I felt like if I can just uncover how they were able to do that, how the indigenous peoples in the Philippines have become so active politically in local politics, then that would be enough contribution for my dissertation. The Cordillera also has a distinct menu of cultural practices, customary laws, and governance systems. Cordillera's experience in empowering its indigenous population is also very rich and extensive, although very complex as well. Cordillera is among the pioneering regions selected to contribute to developing culture-sensitive learning materials aimed to indigenize education. This experience in determining how IP education should look like is a significant source of insights on how local or indigenous knowledge can be successfully integrated in formal education, which was the topic of discussion yesterday, the whole Indigenous Peoples Education Program. There had been 2 unsuccessful plebiscites to ratify regional autonomy in Cordillera, and this is seen by some as a failure to realize a constitutional mandate to further empower the region and its indigenous people. So if citizen competence is about direct democracy and deciding on ballot measures, I wanted to figure out why Cordillera autonomy failed twice in the Cordillera. And although there are many studies done on this topic already, my framing of it as an issue of competence, I think will add to the narrative. There is also a discrepancy between official records and estimates of IP population attributed to the absence of formal census, as well as non-registration of births and deaths among indigenous communities in the Cordillera. So this is really problematic because indigenous peoples are not included in the Philippine census. And so we don't have an actual number of indigenous peoples in the Philippines. It has always been an estimate given to us, about 12 to 15% of the population. So that's around 12 to 15 million. But with all the technologies that we have, I think it's about time that we actually do a proper census of them and put them in official records. So just to give you an idea of the kind of data that I found really interesting, I would show you a few slides containing my the data that I am analyzing for this project. So if we look at this is the voter turnout in the Philippines. You see the Philippine turnout in the 2010, 2013, 2016, and 2019 elections compared to the National Capital Region and compared to the Cordillera Administrative Region. If citizen competence is about voting, look at the figures. Cordillera has a higher voter turnout than the National Capital Region, and compared to the national average, 76.37%, 77%, 83%, 78.53%. This is astounding, considering that, in terms of individual resource, compared to the National Capital Region, the Cordillera Administrative Region probably has a lower educational level, or the poverty incidence is higher, and their their voting precincts may also be farther away from where they live. And yet, time and time again, indigenous peoples in the Cordillera show up and participate during elections, to a point that you can see how high the voter turnout in this region is compared to the National Capital Region or the national average in the Philippines. The second one is about the mandatory IP representation. So I have mentioned that indigenous peoples dominate local politics in Cordillera. But then there is also the mandatory IP representation, which is now a policy. And if you look at the data, in Cordillera, it's less than half. The number of seats filled up for IP mandatory representative is just less than 50%. Out of the total 1,127, there are only 568 seats filled as of April 2019. I interviewed people in the Cordillera, indigenous people's mandatory representatives, and there seems to be a sentiment that because Cordillera is already dominated by indigenous peoples, there seems to be no point or no added value to putting in an Indigenous people's mandatory representatives. Of course, this is debated. And in my dissertation, I have made an entire argument about why this should not be seen as this assumption that because they're already dominant, there should no longer be IP mandatory representative is not tenable. And perhaps at a later time, I can also share with you the data and my data and analysis of that. In IPRA, Indigenous peoples are also mandated to maintain ecological balance and restore denuded forests or denuded areas. So it's one of their tasks. And their citizen competence is actually measured by this. How good are they? How good are Indigenous peoples in maintaining ecological balance and protecting their environment as stewards? So if we look at the data, we can see that in Cordillera, the forest gain is actually there is forest gain across time from 2003 to 2015 in Abra, in Apayao. Only in Benguet is there a negative, is there a forest loss, but in Abra, Apayao, Ifugao, Kalinga, and Mountain Province throughout the years, there seems the Indigenous peoples have seemed to have been able to perform their function as environmental stewards and restore denuded forests. So if this is a test of competence, if this is a mark of citizen competence, I see that Indigenous peoples in the Cordillera are doing good. There are still a lot of problems in this area, but records show that they are actually doing something because the national trend is the opposite. In the Philippines, there is forest loss all over the country. And if you look at the data for the Philippines, you can see that our forest cover is actually decreasing, but not in the Cordillera. And then the FPIC. I also looked at the free and prior informed consent. So these are the headlines from 2008 to 2019, about 10 years. I have looked at the Baguio Midland Courier for their reports on free and prior informed consent. And these are just some of the key headlines about free and prior informed consent. Now, there are Indigenous peoples who have given their consent, and there are Indigenous peoples or Indigenous communities who have rejected the project and not given their consent. A lot of questions were asked about FPIC 2 days ago, the other day, and they are also interesting and quite intense. Why do we need an FPIC? Why is it so hard to get an FPIC? But FPIC is also important. It's critical to the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples. So by looking at this, you can see that FPIC seems to be a way of tilting the balance in favor of Indigenous peoples. Before, anyone can just come into their ancestral domain and do whatever they please. But now with FPIC, Indigenous peoples are given an instrument where they can take control and direct the pace of development or activity that is happening within their ancestral domains. So for me, the IP's enhanced legal capacity to resist or even question activities happening inside their ancestral domains is reflective of what might be considered breaking away from their social mark as marginalized or victims of this power imbalance. Now they have an instrument that they can actually make use in order to fight those people that are coming into their ancestral domains with malintention. With the enactment of state laws recognizing IP's rights, IPs now have in their possession a powerful tool to exercise self-determination along with the ability to contribute to the production of new structures of power and systems of knowledge in society. And the IPs have shown that they consciously participate not only in the consumption of FPIC laws crafted by the state, but in the production reproduction, and even modification of their substantive elements. At best, indigenous peoples were able to use FPIC to protect their rights under the law, and at worst, of course, it was used by more enterprising factions in society to encroach into indigenous people's domains. IPED, in terms of indigenous people's education, enables indigenous youths to learn their traditions and see them appreciated, integrated, and validated within formal educational institutions. So it's a game changer in Cordillera. And Cordillera is a pioneer in this area. There are also curricula that are adopted not only in elementary and high school, but also in tertiary level educations. And there are trainings, and teachers are making their own materials informed by indigenous knowledge and experience that they then bring to the classroom to teach our students with. Now, the bigger question here is, because we're talking here of indigenous knowledge systems taught in formal educational institutions, what is the role of indigenous knowledge then, and how useful it is in developing civic values that support Filipino citizenship? If we think that there seems to be a decline of citizenship or the decline of civic virtue, people are no longer people no longer know the values of their community, or they don't really know how to relate fairly and honestly and civilly with the other, then what is the role then of indigenous knowledge in cultivating this sense of civic virtue that can support our idea of also good Filipino citizenship? Now, this is my framework. What I wanted to do now is to look at it holistically. So instead of just looking at FPIC or merit-based scholarship or IP education, I wanted to put together the puzzle and illustrate the narrative that all these things, all these policies and guidelines contribute to building citizen competence. So this is the framework that the initial framework that I have devised. I argue that IPRA provides the opportunity, ability, and motivation. Basically, opportunity means they are now given the power to share information through deliberative processes and structures and aggregate their preferences. It also gives them ability as developed capacities with all these merit-based scholarship, indigenous people's education, so that they can develop their cognitive capacity, their leadership capacity through IPMR, and participate more competently in politics. And lastly, motivation, because the issues are local. If we have regional autonomy, for instance, the government is more local, the issues are more local, then you can motivate individuals to participate more in politics, because the studies have shown that one of the reasons why people are ignorant about politics or they don't have any desire to participate is because these issues are not their primary concern. They feel removed from these issues. But once you localize the issues, then arguably a citizen will be more motivated to know about politics and actually participate, because the issues at hand directly affect them. So what this framework allows us to do is to expand our conception of citizen competence beyond just political knowledge. And even if you take political knowledge, I do not deal with just looking at political knowledge as measured by level of education. I wanted to know about indigenous knowledge systems and practices and how the lived experiences of the indigenous peoples can contribute to political knowledge. So that framework, I believe, would allow me to expand our conception of citizen competence. It also draws attention to a conception of citizen competence that highlights indigenous experience, which is largely unexplored, unwritten, and untheorized in competence literature. Now, most citizens in contemporary representative democracies have limited opportunity, ability, and even motivation to govern themselves. In contrast, Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination is guaranteed under IPRA and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This empowers Indigenous peoples to use their own governing system and decision-making structures, as well as determine their own priorities and processes for development. Under both national and international laws, Indigenous peoples are to be autonomous, self-governing, and empowered. Definitely, these are the marks of a competent citizen. And while your average non-Indigenous person would probably not have as much inclination to participate in politics because of all the problems that I have enumerated earlier, Indigenous peoples actually are by law encouraged and mandated to take care of their environment, to promote and protect their cultural integrity, and also to develop themselves as self-governing, autonomous, and empowered communities. However, given the political and social invisibility of Indigenous peoples in the Philippines, their narratives are usually overlooked, if not excluded, in research and public records. I believe that by studying IPRA, we can illuminate how they can be better represented in both research and public records. IPRA is consequential to competence building to the extent that it provides wide-ranging instruments that enhance the opportunity, ability, and motivation of Indigenous peoples to reassert themselves, to reassert their place as citizens of the Philippine nation state. But centuries of marginalization and oppression cannot be reversed in 2 decades. So those people who are getting frustrated about the improper implementation of IPRA or all the problems connected to the implementation of IPRA, and who say that perhaps it's time to cut off IPRA or to stop IPRA or to do something else with IPRA, what we can say is that they have been marginalized for so long, and it may be unfair to think that only after 2 decades everything can be reversed and they can now be considered, they are now brought back to their rightful status and strength as Indigenous peoples. It definitely would take more time than just 2 decades. The trend, I think, is promising in the areas of Indigenous education and free and prior informed consent, despite their problems. But more can be done in the areas of ancestral domain protection, mandatory representation, and regional autonomy, at least in the context of Cordillera. So by analyzing the gains and challenges of having IPRA, I hope to offer a framework for constructing a robust understanding of citizen competence informed by Indigenous knowledge and experience, by going local, by going Indigenous, and using their lived experiences to inform a theory that has not actually been interrogated this way before, I think is my main contribution. So thank you.
Thank you for the incredibly interesting talk, Professor Peñalba. I think the topics you brought up of citizen competence and voter knowledge is kind of something that's all on our mind. It's very timely with the elections coming up and things like that. And it's such an interesting perspective to look at. I'd like to remind our participants who are watching that you can send your questions via Zoom chat or in the comment section of our Facebook live stream. And our speakers will be answering questions during the open forum section at the end of our program. Please allow me now to introduce our next speaker. HENDRIX BONGALON is a practicing lawyer based in Angeles City, Pampanga. He also serves as a lecturer at the Tarlac State University School of Law. He earned his BA degree in social sciences, majoring in history from UP Baguio, and his Bachelor of Laws from St. Louis University. At present, he's taking up his Master of Laws at San Sebastian College, Recoletos, Manila, and TSU Consortium. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Sir Hendrix.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So I'm excited to be here. Mamay was my professor back in college, and so with my mentor, no, my nanay, Ma'am Leia Bayo. Good morning, everyone. So I'll be discussing some legal principles, but I hope that I will be able to make it or I will be able to present it in a non-super legalist. Of course, we will be talking about legalities, but we will try to break it down because we are all students of law. Mamai, when presenting her paper a while ago, was talking about how incredible our laws are, and of course, she has some concerns with its implementations, but here we can see is that we are all actually students of law. So I'll be presenting my here. I'm not good with technology, but I'll try my best to. There. So I'll be presenting both the international and domestic legal frameworks on the protection of indigenous knowledge and resources against biopiracy. So the reason why I'm studying this, because actually this is just a part and parcel of a bigger study on biopiracy that I'm making, and hopefully I'll be able to finish it before I'll finish my master's. But the issue on biopiracy caught my attention during one of the conventions or conferences that I've attended. So after our presentation, former NCIP chairperson, Ma'am Briggs Pawid, approached us. And because our paper then was about indigenous knowledge system and practices vis-a-vis intellectual property law in the Philippines, on our whether we have sufficient laws to protect the entire intellectual properties of the indigenous peoples. And Ma'am Briggs, after that presentation, actually approached us and raised her concerns about also as to the doubts of indigenous peoples when it comes to documentation of practices, because that's one of the gaps in the protection of indigenous peoples' intellectual properties. But Ma'am Briggs was discussing the fears of many communities against biopiracy, because when documented, it is actually easier to steal these practices and to have them patented. And if we say they are patented, they will be exclusively used by whoever is granted the patent. So that's the entire background on my study of biopiracy, on why I started studying about biopiracy. So biopiracy basically is just the unauthorized extraction of biological resources and or associated traditional knowledge from developing countries, or the patenting of the spurious invention based on knowledge or resources without compensation. So this is very much relevant because of the indigenous peoples, diba? We have problems on the protection of different forms of intellectual properties, and the focus now is really on biopiracy. Okay, so on biopiracy. So in this paper, I tried to make a survey as to the international law frameworks and on the domestic law framework, and how to protect, on how do we really protect our indigenous knowledge and resources against this biopiracy, or if at all, do we have sufficient laws? Do we have sufficient international law principles which we can use to protect our indigenous knowledge and resources against the theft made by these scrupulous corporations and other individuals making patents out of our traditional practices, or out of our traditional knowledge. So it's important to look at this in two levels. First is under international law, and second is under domestic law. Because one, international law, traditionally, the subject of international law are just states. So you can impose international law principles against states. But of course, that's just a traditional view. Now, individuals and even indigenous peoples and ethnic communities are now considered subject of international law. But traditionally, it's just the states who are which are the subjects of this tradition of this international law. Like for example, if a certain group or certain individuals would commit biopiracy in a particular community in the Philippines, it will not be traditionally it will not be the international law that would govern. It will be your domestic laws, and your international law would take care of the sanctions against states which refuses or neglects to protect its citizens within its sphere. So that's how traditionally that's how international law works. But of course, as I've mentioned, even international law is now evolving. That even individuals, we hear some individuals being subjected to international law processes. So even individuals and indigenous peoples and communities are now subject of international laws. So let's start with the international law framework. And one of the instruments that we can see, though this is just a declaration, of course, when we say declaration, it is more morally binding than a legally binding instrument to nation states. One of the international law instruments that we have will be the UNDRIP or the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which provides, the mechanisms on how do indigenous peoples be protected against against biopiracy, and mainly, as mentioned, as repeatedly mentioned, still the free, prior, informed consent. That is the main protection given under your UNDRIP. And one of the articles in UNDRIP gives recognition. This is just on a recognition level. We're still in the UNDRIP. We're in the recognition level. The recognition that that indigenous peoples really have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Why is this important? Because these are the usual subjects of biopiracy. I remember one of the concerns of Ma'am Briggs when we were talking about biopiracy is, for example, your turmeric. Though I'm not aware. As far as I know, it's not yet patented. But the use of bitter ground, for example, yung ampalaya, diba? Traditionally ginagamit yan traditional medicine na yan. Then manaka-naka, it's already patented, diba? That you have to pay royalties to these corporations using bitter ground as medicine or as a supplement. But that is a traditional practice. Yung paggamit ng steel, kohol, diba? For as pain relievers, diba? Na ipatent. But that is a traditional practice. So it becomes the exclusive it becomes the exclusive ownership of particular corporations, diba? Owning these patents, when in fact this has been practiced by the indigenous peoples, by the indigenous peoples communities for the longest time. So it was actually that's why we have to look at laws that would protect them. Dahil nangyayari, it's actually it's a reality. It's really happening. Okay, so there are actual patents awarded to different corporations governing some practices which are considered traditional. On whether were there violations, was it proper, I think that would be a subject of additional study. What I want just to show is just it's happening. So the control of our traditional knowledge and cultural expression, according to UNDRIP, we also have that control, we the indigenous people. So your UNDRIP is one of the instruments. Of course, the maintenance of our flora and fauna, and also again that is the usual subject of biopiracy. So but what I want to focus in, I want to zero in, because we have other instruments that we can use protecting culture, protecting our traditional practices in general. Like we have your ILO Convention 169. We can also look. We can also draw some recognition, at least at the very minimum, or protection from your international, your ICCPR. So there are a lot of instruments, but I want to zero in on our Biodiversity Convention, because this is a binding treaty to the Philippines, being a party to these conventions. And because these conventions, especially the Nagoya Principle, which I will be discussing later, lays down certain obligation to party states, including the Philippines. And then we'll look at our local laws later on. Do we really have laws implementing these international treaties for which we are a part, which we ratified, and well, the Nagoya Principle for which we acceded. So our Biodiversity Convention was ratified by the Philippines. When we say ratified, at the very beginning, the Philippines is already a party, so it signed the treaty. So it signed the treaty. So the main one of the main comments about about this convention is that its contents about biopiracy against indigenous knowledge it's really lacking. It's not sufficient. There's no sufficient protection on indigenous people's knowledge and resources against biopiracy. If at all, the only provision on this Biodiversity Convention on biopiracy is in Article 8, J, paragraph J, which provides that subject to its national legislation, respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyle relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So this is the only provision that we can use using this convention. And based on some commentaries about the convention, the reason why IKSP is not really included in the convention is that during that time in 1994, even the indigenous peoples were really hesitant to include IKSPs because including them, or if we include IKSPs in the convention, to them during that time they look at it as it may mean, or it may send a message that we are commercializing these practices because we have to, why are we including them in the Biodiversity Convention? Plus also in the Biodiversity Convention, it is actually mainly a protection of environment. If at all, this is an environmental law instrument, which of course we cannot compartmentalize by indigenous people's issue, but the perspective of the convention is more on biodiversity and environmental protection really. But that comment was, I believe, addressed by the Nagoya Protocol. Your Nagoya Protocol, when we say Nagoya Protocol, it's less formal than a treaty, but it is as legally binding as your treaty. Okay, so your protocol is, when you say protocol, it is a way of implementing a main convention. Like, kumbaga, sa domestic law, it's your implementing rules and regulations. So it may provide additional obligation to party states. And usually those parties that ratify your main convention would eventually ratify some protocols. So actually the Nagoya Protocol, the Nagoya Protocol is dated October of 2010, but the Philippines only acceded to it last December 28, 2015. So, well, even if the Philippines did not ratify it, meaning they're not original parties to the instrument itself, they're not part of the original signatories, it is as legally binding as ratification if a country accedes to a protocol or to an instrument. So here, it's actually more of access benefit sharing agreement, but here there are a lot of most of the contents of most of the provisions of this protocol pertains to the protection of traditional knowledge, indigenous resources. So here, the objective of the protocol is for the fair and equitable sharing benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. So, and of course, in your benefit sharing agreement, it is repeatedly mentioned in the protocol that it is not necessarily monetary, though of course communities can enter into agreements with whoever wants to access genetic resources or indigenous knowledge. They can enter into monetary benefit sharing agreement, which may include non-monetary benefit sharing agreement. So it says here that your Nagoya Protocol shall apply to even to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. Plus, of course, again, your protocol, my main concern with the protocol is that it dodges the obligation to your domestic laws. It says it repeatedly mentioned about parties taking legislative, administrative, or policy as appropriate with the aim of ensuring the benefit. So it not just as the obligation to your nation party, to your parties to create laws, administrative orders, policies to implement or to make this access benefits or this access benefit sharing viable or feasible. And also it obligates states to take legislative, administrative, or policy measures as appropriate in order that the benefits arising from the utilization of traditional knowledge are shared in a fair and equitable way with indigenous and local communities holding such knowledge. So here in Nagoya Principle, it's more direct. It's really about sharing or fair and equitable sharing with indigenous and local communities. It's expressed. It's not just, it's no longer just a general provision or recognition on the rights to free, prior, and informed consent, the rights to traditional knowledge. Here, there is really an obligation for the parties to take legislative and administrative policies to implement this so that indigenous peoples or local communities holding this knowledge will have benefit. And actually, here you have Article 7. So you'll see here that in accordance with domestic law, of course, recognizing your domestic law. So we have other ways. Like for example, another country wants to come in the Philippines to access genetic resources. Then your protocol obligates the nation state to provide for a legislative or for domestic law as to how this would happen in order to protect the indigenous local communities against biopiracy. So here, boundary cooperation. This just pertains to indigenous knowledge shared by indigenous peoples in different jurisdictions. And here we have an entire article that is your Article 12 of the Nagoya Protocol about traditional knowledge associated with generic or with genetic resources. If you look at this principle, see, it's very the obligation is specific. The obligation is expressed that how would this or how would parties to this Nagoya Protocol implement this protocol? Like it should provide for a community protocols for the fair and equitable sharing. The minimum requirement, it should provide minimum requirements of mutually agreed terms. This may be a product, of course, of the natural imbalance against your corporations against this community. So your country should provide for minimum requirement for mutually agreed upon terms. So ano yung minimum na pwedeng i-allow? So dapat yung bansa mo may ganong batas or at least rules. And your party state, dapat tinitingnan natin dito as the obligation of the Philippines being party to Nagoya Protocol, ha. So this is an obligation of the Philippines because it has acceded to the Nagoya Protocol, and of course it has to provide model contract clauses for benefit sharing agreement arising from the utilization of traditional knowledge. So di ba sobrang sabi ko ang specific. Then as far as possible, it should not restrict the customary use and exchange of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge within and amongst indigenous and local communities in accordance with the objectives of these conditions. So this is your Nagoya Protocol. Again, this was just acceded by the Philippines last December 28, 2015. So fairly, yung obligation naman ng Philippines to actually provide for this, for all of this as contained in the protocol for which it is a party is fairly new, but even before acceding to these protocols, may mga ano naman, we already have laws and system in place. So yun yung that's what we're gonna study on the next part of this paper Of course, again, it also mentioned about prior informed consent. That this is your Nagoya Protocol. Okay, so how about your domestic legal framework? So what if we have international law covering this protection against biopiracy? So what if we are a party to an agreement? 'Di ba? So ano naman ngayon? What is its what's its effect when it comes to your local laws? And of course, we have here under your Philippine legal framework, we follow two principles in making those international law part of our domestic laws. Number one is doctrine of incorporation, and number two, doctrine of transformation. Your doctrine of incorporation, it said we don't need any further step to make generally accepted principles of international law as part of our laws. So if that's generally accepted principle of international law, hindi mo kailangang i-transform into a domestic law for it to be an applicable law in the Philippines. Your doctrine of transformation, on the other hand, requires that an international law be transformed into a domestic law through legislation. Okay? So now, so ngayon, yung protection against biodiversity, it may not still be considered a generally accepted principle of international law, because if we say generally accepted principle of international law, we really look at so many factors like the magnitude of practice, ilang states ba ang nagpa-practice niyan, ilang international law expert ba ang nagre-recognize niyan. So the protection of against biodiversity may not be in itself a considered generally accepted principle of international law. But pacta sunt servanda, meaning parties complying with their international law or international law obligation, is a generally accepted principle of international law. Meaning, kahit hindi natin i-legislate na ang Philippines dapat sumusunod sa kanyang international law obligation, given yon, bahagi yon, yung principle na yon, bahagi ng ating batas. Kasi it's a generally accepted principle of international law. And as we've mentioned, pursuant to pacta sunt servanda, your principle of pacta sunt servanda, or our compliance with our contractual obligation in good faith, then we should comply with our international obligation under the Nagoya Principle at least, and other instruments. Of course, your ICCPR is your of course your human rights. It's GAPOIL, no? It's generally accepted principle of international law. Under your Biodiversity Convention, so we should follow those, because pacta sunt servanda is an generally accepted principle of international law. And unlike other countries, I've seen, I'm not sure, I have not read, I think Malaysia has transformed the Nagoya Principle as their domestic law. The Philippines, we have not yet transferred it into our domestic law. I don't know if it's the Nagoya Principle or the Biodiversity Convention that it has transformed into its domestic law. So siguro yun yung isang pwede nating tignan, no. But we have other laws, no. We have other laws na nagprotect na pwede nating gamitin aside from yung insistence natin doon sa pag-comply natin sa international law obligation natin. Okay? So because, well, aside from compliance with our international law obligation, our Constitution recognizes our rights to our cultures, and of course, this can be used as basis also in the protection of indigenous knowledge. But particularly on bioprospecting, what laws, or what at least what issuances do we have that we can use when it comes to bioprospecting, and so that we will be able to protect our indigenous knowledge and resources against biopiracy? We have our Executive Order 247. Actually, our Executive Order 247, it's an old executive order na minsan hindi napapansin. hindi na siya masyadong napapansin, but this is in response to our obligation to the Biodiversity Convention. In 1994, diba, you have your Biodiversity Convention, and as compliance with not yet the Nagoya Principle, with your Biodiversity Convention, on May 18, 1995, EO 247 prescribed for guidelines and established regulatory framework for the prospecting of biological and genetic resources. So Section 2 of your EO 247 provides for the requirement of FPIC, still with the FPIC, prospecting of biological and genetic resources shall be allowed within ancestral lands and domains of indigenous cultural communities only with the prior informed consent of such communities, obtained in accordance with customary laws and concerned community. We have to bear in mind there's no IPRA yet during this time, ha? Kasi 'di ba, sabi ni Ma'am Mai, you have your as to how do we conduct FPIC, we have guidelines 2006 and the latest is 2000 and then it was amended to 2012. So but during this time there's no IPRA yet because IPRA was 1997. Okay? So yun, so prospecting of biological and genetic resources shall be allowed only with the free prior informed consent of concerned local communities. And to implement your EO 247, the Administrative Order 96-20 was promulgated. So how do we conduct prospecting of biological genetic resources within areas of local communities? It's still via FPIC, prior informed consent. Okay? Medyo wala pang free, diba? Pagdating ng IPRA, free prior na nasanay na tayo sa FPIC, no? So, and of course, the government agencies in areas including protected areas shall see to it that the consent required is obtained. Okay? So, ito mayroon pa siyang nilagay na traditional customary, dapat if appropriate may concurrence ng Council of Elders in a public consultation in the site concerned. And then later on, we will know this as FPIC process, diba? So that's your EO 247, which we can use in bioprospecting. And of course, in 2005, we have joint DNR, DA, PCSD, NCIP guidelines on bioprospecting. But this one, sobrang ano naman to, very detailed as to how to apply for or how to conduct bioprospecting in the Philippines. So, ang maganda dito talaga is, ano yan eh, yun nga, di ba yung concern natin is ang daming concerned agencies. So, this is a joint guideline. So, ano yung ginagawa niya? You have to pay application fees, performance bond. Kasi sometimes, di ba? And I think in 2005, buti nga mayroon na ganitong in 2005 because sometimes when we talk about culture, when we talk about indigenous knowledge, resources, medyo ano marami pa rin sa atin yung allergic na makakita ng amount, di ba? So, but here it's specific, the payment of application fees and rehabilitation, performance bond, bioprospecting fees, benefit share, FPIC. It also provides the requirement of FPIC, benefit sharing agreement. It provides for a benefit sharing agreement, but I hope that these will be revisited so that royalties may also be given to indigenous communities, directly to indigenous communities, because your annual global gross sales share, your share in the sales of course, if an indigenous knowledge or practice is patented, diba, it will be used for mainly for commercial purposes, really for profit. So I hope that indigenous communities would soon have at least a share in the gross sales and royalties if the community so desires. Okay, if the community so desires. And of course, we have here non-financial benefits and sanction if there is a violation of the guidelines for bioprospecting in the Philippines. There can be a cancellation of bioprospecting undertaking, that's your BU, and a criminal case under Wildlife Act. I'm looking at the Wildlife Act. Really, I don't know how do we prosecute them criminally under Wildlife Act. But your NCIP, I think these agencies are extracting whatever they can extract from our existing laws also. Okay, so because and we must give it to them. We also have our NCIP Administrative Order Series number 1 series of 2012, the Indigenous Knowledge System, ITSPs and Customary Laws research and documentation guidelines. This one, in the definition, bioprospecting was defined. It's among those terms defined, but in the body, I cannot find any part of the guideline for which is specifically specifically provided for bioprospecting. But anyway, based on the guideline, there's still your FPIC and equitable sharing agreements is still required under our NCIP or number 1 series of 2012. This can also be used as legal protection against biopiracy. Of course, we have our Traditional and Alternative Medicine Act. So part of its policy, parts of the policy on why this law was enacted was so that indigenous societies, well, sabi indigenous societies, not my would own their knowledge of traditional medicine. So it's a recognition that, of course, we have traditional medicine, we have traditional use, traditional medical use, and the Traditional Alternative Medicine Act is a recognition, or it recognizes that, and it also provides for institutionalizes, or try to institutionalize promulgation of support to traditional medicines. And you have your Philippine Technology Transfer Act for research and development institutes having fundings from government funding agencies. It should disclose any diversity and genetic resource, traditional knowledge, and indigenous systems and practices. Kung merong ganong involved sa kanyang study. Okay, that's under your RA 10045. We have your RA 9147, the act providing for the conservation and protection of wild resources. So there's also a provision on bioprospecting, and the bioprospecting is only allowed if the person or corporations intending to conduct bioprospecting will issue or will execute an undertaking that it would comply to the reasonable terms and conditions that will be imposed for the protection of biodiversity. You have your expanded NIPAS. Diba? Yung NIPAS, we have, many of us are familiar with the NIPAS. We have our old NIPAS law. But in 2018, let's not forget that it is in 2018, your NIPAS was expanded. We have your expanded National Integrated Protected Areas System Act of 2018. Because many of us, when we refer to NIPAS, we still refer to the old one. Many of us still do not refer to the amended or to the expanded NIPAS. So here in your NIPAS, this one is, I think, this offers a stronger protection. This offers us a stronger protection because many of the protected areas are actually ancestral lands, or part of the, at least part of the indigenous communities. And when conducting bioprospecting within their areas, prior clearance, PAMBI clearance, your PAMBI clearance here in PAMBI, because among the composition of this PAMBI will be at least minimum of 1, maximum of 3 from indigenous communities. No, you need clearance subject to existing guidelines before you can conduct bioprospecting in protected areas. So not just in ancestral lands, for as long as it is part of the protected areas. And in addition thereto, of course, you have your penalty of imprisonment and fine, plus whatever substance derived from that non-permitted bioprospecting will not be allowed. And all revenue earned will be from illegal commercialization thereof shall be forfeited. Okay? But I think the stronger penalty will be, because the penalty for that one, bioprospecting without PAMBI clearance, so a fine of not less than 200,000, but not more than 1 million, or imprisonment of 1 year, but not more than 6 years, or both. Okay, so because this is paragraph S, so there. And then of course we have your Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Our IPRA, we have access to Section 5 of IPRA. So access to biological and genetic resources and to indigenous knowledge related to the conservation, utilization, and enhancement of these resources shall be allowed within ancestral domains only with a free prior informed consent of such community obtained in accordance with customary laws of the concerned communities. So those are your domestic laws. But here, all that I have presented, whether it be Republic Acts, Executive Order, Administrative Circular, these acts, except for the expanded NIPAS, the expanded NIPAS is in 2008 pala, 2018, are issued prior to our accession to the Nagoya Protocol in 2015. So that's one thing that I hope that if we have leaders in the government here, maybe that's one of the thing that they should consider. We have already acceded to the Nagoya Protocol. Baka naman pwede na rin nating i-update yung mga issuances natin, and so that it will be really compliant to the Nagoya Protocol. And diba, that's the minimum. Siguro that's the minimum. And it would be good if we could transform it into a domestic law. Diba? Gawin nating mismong batas para wala nang question. And some of the recommendations, the study of the implementation of laws. Sabi ko, these are just a legal survey of instruments, laws, and domestic. But at this point, I have not really studied as to the implementation of these laws. Nasusunod ba? Kasi as far as I'm concerned, wala pa namang nakasuhan because of biopiracy in government agencies, even if we have your expanded NIPAS, even na nagprovide for criminal, diba, prosecution, even with your Wildlife Act. So let's see, siguro there should be a study on the implementation of these laws. Why are indigenous communities still hesitant really to document their IKSPs, but for fear of biopiracy? But of course, if we are to look at the implementation, we have our Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan by BMB, Biodiversity Management Bureau. Our DNR attached agency BMB has a strategy plan on implementing this Biodiversity Convention. Yung framework niya is 2015 and 2018, 2015 to 2028. And na-mention naman doon ko yung mga about indigenous peoples and indigenous communities, but let's see if in its actual implementation. Also, there should be compilation of existing laws. Recommendation, we should compile existing laws and issuances because, diba, so parang ang hirap, separate instruments, iba-iba nating nahahanap yung pwede nating ma-extract from existing laws. There is no single instrument that provides really for issuances only, or at least that provides for the protection on prospecting or against biopiracy. So kailangan pa nating maghanap kung saan yung ma-maximize natin. So there should be a compilation of these laws. And of course, I'm hoping really for the transformation of the Nagoya Protocol into a domestic law so that magiging batas na talaga siya sa Philippines. So these are my recommendations. And of course, again, this study is just an initial study because I'm planning to conduct a deeper study on this, more comprehensive in the next years to come. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sir Hendrix. I wouldn't say I have much of a legal mind, but I felt like that was so fascinating, hearing laws beyond IPRA on Indigenous studies. And also, I think a lot of our students here at UP Baguio are kind of interested in legal work, and your presentation kind of showed how the legal field and Indigenous studies can kind of intersect. It's such a rich ground for more research as you presented in your recommendations. Thank you so much. To all our participants, you can send your questions in the Zoom chat or in the comments section on our Facebook live stream. There will be a section at the end for an open forum, and we can discuss the presentations. I'm so happy to introduce our third speaker for this morning's session. Sir Kevin Constantine Fonseca is currently working as Community Development Officer 3 of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, Region 3. And he obtained his Bachelor of Arts in Social Sciences, major in Social Anthropology from the University of the Philippines, Baguio. Welcome, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Sir Kevin.
Thank you very much po, Ma'am Kip. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. And nag-message po ako kay Ma'am Mai kanina. Kinakabahan po ako kasi sabi niya natatandaan daw po niya ako. Hindi ko po alam kung baka po yung mga kalokohan namin noon yung natandaan. Pero I'm honored po to be included in this panel with Ma'am Mai and Sir Attorney HENDRIX. And salamat po, Ma'am Leia, for this invitation. And feeling ko po malamig dito sa paligid ko ngayon dahil mga taga UP Baguio po ang aking kausap. But I also see na meron po tayong mga kasama from other government agencies. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. I'm now, nandito po ako ngayon sa Florida Blanca, Pampanga. I apologize for the weak internet kung sakali man pong mawawala. Nasa field po as I speak. Yun po ang aking work ngayon. I started in the NCIP as a community affairs officer in Zambales, and then promoted to being the regional planning officer in 2016. And now I am a full-fledged community development officer, handling po the province of Pampanga. But my presentation later on, dun po sa community development, will focus on the Dumaguete Indigenous community in Dingalan, Aurora. And babalik ako sa Pampanga doon sa isa pa pong halimbawa or illustration paano or ano po ang itsura ng community development, because our topic for this morning is Indigenous people's rights and development. So nasimulan na po yung rights nung dalawa po nating nauna, and then I will be giving concrete examples kung paano naman po ito nakikita as far as the NCIP is concerned. So, ayan, maedup. It's a Dumagat or Dumaguete term, which means mabuhay. And I will begin my presentation by discussing the Indigenous People's Masterplan. Ano po ba ito? If we can move to the next slide, makikita po natin dito yung pong 14 major thematic concerns na tinatawag. Saan po galing itong 14 major thematic concerns na ito? Since 2015, the Commission have been conducting po cluster conferences bago pa po yung pandemic, sa leadership pa po ni former chairperson Leonor Quintayo. Sinasagawa po yung mga cluster conferences na ito, and marami pong lumabas na mga issues, as in sobrang dami, libo-libo po yan, pero summarized po siya into this what we call now the 14 major thematic concerns. Nandyan po yung nangunguna, mainit na topic po lagi, FPIC violations. Second, marami pong problema sa formal recognition of ancestral domains. Third, wala pong control and management ng mga ancestral domains. And nandyan po ika-apat, destruction of ecosystems within ancestral domains. The reason I'm saying this is because ito po yung basihan, ito po yung angkla ng Indigenous People's Masterplan. Ito po yung pinanggalingan ni NCIP, ito po yung mahabang proseso na kanyang pinagdaanan before it came up with what we call now the Indigenous People's Masterplan as mandated by the Indigenous People's Rights Act. So ikalima po, marami pong overlapping ng mga claims over these ancestral domains. Nandyan po yung mga private properties, nandyan po yung mga dating mga base militar, nandyan po ngayon yung mga watershed, nandyan po yung mga economic zones. Ika-anim, meron pa rin pong displacement ng mga katutubo from their ancestral domains and ancestral lands. Nandyan pa rin po yung discrimination, number 7. And yung number 8, from the language po mismo na sinulat ng mga katutubo pagkawala ng kanilang kultura bilang mga katutubo or bilang mga IPs. Number 9, traditional or indigenous governance is weak. Number 10, kakulangan sa kaalaman sa karapatan. Number 11, the impact of government not felt, no? Including that of the NCIP. And yun na nga, kasunod po niya, number 12, no? The capacity of the NCIP to deliver its mandate, no? Pero nagre-reflect na rin po dito hindi lang si NCIP but all other agencies or government agencies na supposedly nagki-cater doon po sa needs and rights ng mga IPs, peace and security and all other concerns. Doon po nakalamp na sa number 14. So ito po yung 14 major thematic concern na basihan ng tinatawag po natin, sabi ko kanina, na Indigenous Peoples Master Plan. I understand na yung pong nagdaang 3 araw or 2 araw, pinag-usapan na po yung iba't ibang mga topics, no? May kinalaman sa IKSP, sa FPIC, and even yung development, no? Yung ADS-TPP, Ancestral Domain, Sustainable Development and Protection Plan na pinapatupad po ng NCIP with our communities. So, sa next slide, makikita po ninyo bilang tugon, as an institution, si NCIP, ito po yung kanyang tugon, no? We sought the help of experts in the field of community development anthropology, particularly po yung GIZ COSERAP, in coming up with the IP Master Plan, no? A roadmap to empowerment of IPs. So 12 strategies po ito na directly tumutugon doon po sa 14 major thematic concerns, no? If we will go to the next slide, meron po dyan isa-isa, no, nagagawin or dapat ginagawa. Yan. So since nauuna po yung issue ng FPIC, nauuna din po doon sa IP Master Plan yung pong pag-ensure ng compliance doon sa free, prior, and informed consent. So marami pong ginagawa since 2 taon pa lang po, 2 taon pa lamang na isinasagawa ito pong IP Master Plan, and lahat po na nakalagay dyan sa FPIC, ensuring compliance to the FPIC guidelines, ay mahaba pa po ang tinatakbo nito, no? Hindi po ito kompleto talaga. We are currently reviewing all existing, no, memorandum of agreements or memorandum of understanding entered into by our indigenous communities. At dito po nakikita natin, no, yung mga, sabihin na nating mga kakulangan, mga kahinaan, no, weakness pagdating po doon sa mga MOA po na ito. Nanggagaling primarily doon sa dalawang bagay, no, yung pong kakayahan ng mga IPs to negotiate, and ikalawa yung pong kanyang technical partner, no, which is si NCIP din naman. Nandyan po yung policy enhancement and capacity development ng mga leaders po natin in negotiations, and marami pa po mababasa po niyo diyan. Tinitignan din po ngayon ng current commission yung pong lahat po. Noon meron po kaming inventory ngayon na ginagawa ng mga nagdaang mga FPIC processes na to, at iniisa-isa po ng commission kung saan po nagkakaroon ng problema, no, nasaan yung bottleneck, no. Maayong buntag po, ma'am. I'm afraid this presentation is not available sa website ni NCIP, but I am willing po to give this presentation naman later. And then doon po sa topic or sa issue ng wala pong hindi po nasi-secure, no? Hindi pa po nire-recognize yung mga lupa or mga ancestral domains. Nandiyan po yung securing ancestral domains, second priority po yan. But I must say na mahirap po ang budget, nahihirapan po sa budget si NCIP. And ngayon po, no, meron pong malaking effort to fund, ibuhos ang pondo doon po sa pagkilala or doon sa delineation process na tinatawag, para po yung lahat ng more than 1,000 ancestral domains sa buong Pilipinas ay maikanti po ito, no, masecure po yung kanilang titles. And kasama po doon sa pagkakanti, syempre yung pong development planning, kasama po yon doon sa strategy na to. And doon sa issue ng mahina ang governance, no, meron pong strategy to strengthen the IP governance through the IPS-IPO. Meron po tayong guidelines on the documentation of the indigenous political structure. Meron na pong kaunting progress dito ang NCIP, pero hindi pa po lahat, ano po. For instance, in Central Luzon, isa pa lamang po, isa o dalawa pa lamang, no, yung pong ancestral domains or indigenous cultural community na meron pong documentation, no, comprehensive documentation of their indigenous political structure. And yung pong IPS na tinatawag, malaki po yung kanyang role doon sa iba pang mga community development na mga iba pang ginagawa, no, patungkol sa community development. For instance, the FPIC process, syempre nandyan po yung decision making, yung consensus building, kailangan po ang IPS dyan, yung pong community royalty development management, even the implementation of the ADS-TPP, and marami pa pong iba, no? So isa po yan sa mga priorities. In fact, mamaya doon sa isa pa pong bahagi ng IP Masterplan, the 11 building blocks, makikita po ninyo, priority po doon yung indigenous peoples or indigenous political structure documentation. Nandyan din po yung iba't ibang strategies or sub-strategies under this strategy number 3, including the IP Governance Academy. Meron pong kaunting success, especially in the Davao region, the IP Rights Watch, the IP Peace Agenda, and so on and so forth. Sa next slide, makikita po ninyo yung tatlo pang susunod na strategies. Can you hear me? Hindi po ba ako nawawala? Okay. Yan. So strategy number 4, ensuring participation in governance. Nangunguna po dito yung pong kanilang indigenous people's mandatory representation sa mga local legislative bodies, no, sa barangay, sa municipal, sa city, and even sa province, no. And sa Central Luzon, I would say nasa 90% po yung pong mga IPMR natin na seated sa mga local legislative bodies. But of course, yung pong quality, no, yung kanilang na-i-deliver doon po sa council, sa mga councils na to, ay iba pong usapan yon, no. So we are just kumbaga nandun pa lang sa first step, no, maitalaga yung pong mga IPMR na ito sa mga local legislative body para maisulong po yung indigenous people's agenda. Kasama din po dito yung syempre yung role na naman ng IPS ng kanilang malakas na governance system, indigenous political structure na nagwo-work, no, sa mga communities para matupad po ito. Ensuring equity and service delivery, no, focus on health, ensuring access to government services, kasi nga po ang isa sa mga nakita na sinasabi ng mga katutubo, hindi naman nararamdaman yung pong presensya ng gobyerno, no? Yung presence ng government services not felt, sabi po nila. So nandyan po yung iba't ibang strategy. And now, yung pong mga convergence initiatives, the whole of nation approach, marami pong debate at marami pong criticism about this. But at the local level, nakikita po namin pa konti-konti yung pong success nito. Together with other national government agencies, line agencies, no, lalong-lalo na po doon sa socio-economic, no, yung pong tinatawag natin na PRLEC, no, Poverty Reduction Cluster. Sa next slide, yung pong tatlo pang strategies, enhancing institutional capacities, dito po yan sa NCIP. Kasama po dyan yung matagal ng pinaplano na yung pong pagdadagdag ng mga expert na magtatrabaho mismo sa NCIP, no. At nandyan po yung harmonization ng mga mandato, structures and mechanisms, no, policy advocacy, hindi lamang po, no, yung harmonization ng mga policies ni NCIP, yung mga guidelines. Nakita po kasi na medyo parang tinatrato pa, magkakaiba yung pong mga guidelines ng NCIP mismo. And at the same time, yung pong mga seemingly conflicting policies ni NCIP with other government agencies, for example, the DENR, no, marami pong mga usapan na diyan. Marami pong mga issue diyan, no, pagdating po sa resource management, halimbawa ng mga katutubo sa loob ng kanilang ancestral domain. Ensuring fulfillment of rights, madami po 'yan, no? And mababasa po niyo diyan. Meron pong focus particularly doon po sa mga sektor ng IP women, IP youth, and I will end this presentation mamaya doon sa yung konkretong ginagawa ngayon pagdating po sa mga IP youth natin. Yung pong last 3 strategies sa next slide, makikita po natin yung ating peace agenda, yung ating sustainability, ensuring sustainability. Ang focus po nito yung ating maayos na pagbuo ng mga community development plans, no, through the ADS-TPP. And later, medyo mahaba po yung dedicate na time in discussing, no, the community development framework. And of course, ang end goal po nito, ang best case scenario is the empowerment of indigenous peoples. So, yan po yung buod ng IP Master Plan natin. And if you are interested to read the document, I can also provide the document, no, yung pong ginagamit namin in presenting the Indigenous Peoples Master Plan. Pero ngayon po, bahagi na rin sa next slide, isinusulong po ng 8th Commission yung pong 11 building blocks of a resilient, responsive, and relevant ICCs and in ancestral domains. So ito po ay ito pong 11 building blocks na ito, lagi po siyang napag-uusapan sa loob ng NCIP, pine-present po namin sa mga partner agencies at sa mga stakeholders or development partners natin. But basically, yung pong nakapaloob dito sa 11 building blocks ay nasakop na din po doon sa IP Master Plan po natin. So nandyan yung confirmation ng mga IPS, pagpapalakas po ng kanilang governance system, ng kanilang capacity bilang mga may-ari ng ancestral domain, no. Sila po mismo yung tumatayo, nagsasalita for their community, hindi na po sana si NCIP o ibang entity. Nandyan po syempre yung security ng kanilang mga ancestral domain, and then the establishment of Ancestral Domains Management Office. Nasa mandato po ito pero hindi pa po ito talaga fully nakikita or nai-implement. The next slide, you would see yung pong ADS-TPP, yung CRMDP or yung wealth management, no? May kinalaman na din po ito doon sa mga sa proseso ng FPIC, kung maayos na ikakandak ang process ng FPIC. Nandyan din po yung mga royalties kasi, no, mga MOA, especially kung mga extractive na mga industries yung pumapasok sa loob ng ancestral domain, no? And recently nakita po natin yung ginawa ng mga katutubo diyan sa Bakun. Ipinasara po nila, no, yung hydroelectric power plant diyan sa Bakun. Ang nag-decision po noon, ang kumilos po doon, no, hindi naman po ang NCIP kundi yung pong mga leaders mismo, yung mga katutubo mismo, no, ng yung mga IPS po doon sa Bakun, diyan sa Benguet. Institutionalization of the FPIC, of course, effective IPMRs in the legislative bodies. Next slide, you will see, ayun na nga, yung sinasabi ko po, no, malakas na mga pakikipagnegosasyon through MOA dahil yan lang po ang security nila. Mga cooperatives, and sa Mindanao, itinagdag po itong ancestral domain. Malakas po ito na pinag-uusapan yung defense system, no. So, yan po yung summary or pinakabuod ng IP Master Plan. And I will shift now doon sa paano po ito nakikita sa Central Luzon, at least in Central Luzon. Ano po? Kung pag-uusapan po sa next slide, yung pong community development, lagi-lagi po naming ginagamit, no, yung pong Ancestral Domain Sustainable Development and Protection Plan or the ADS-TPP as a framework. And we believe that this is a tool for empowerment of ICC's IPs towards the fulfillment po of their general well-being. And it is used to protect po, the ADS-TPP is used to protect the holistic, okay, holistic kasi siyempre nasa disiplina po tayo ng social sciences, no, holistic and integrated adherence of a particular community to their customs, religious beliefs, traditions, and IKSPs, no, yung Indigenous Knowledge Systems and Practices. And it is a long-term comprehensive spatial development plan with at least 5 years programming, no, yung po yung strategic planning po nila. Sa next slide, balikan lang po natin ito, no. We say sustainable development, pero paano po siya tinitignan, no, at least in the NCIP? We follow still yung pong classic definition niya, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs, no. And hindi man po ito perfectly na re-reflect sa lahat ng mga communities, but at least in the formulation process of their ADS-TPP, ng kanilang mga plans, tinitiyak po natin kahit paano na nasasalamin po ito doon sa kanilang strat plan. The next slide, no, ang question, meron bang sariling konsepto ng kaunlaran ang mga katutubo? Siyempre naman po, no. Especially UP Baguio, mahaba po ang pag-aaral, marami pong mga publications na magpapakita na meron po silang sariling konsepto ng development, kaiba doon sa nakikita ng mainstream, no? At ako po bilang isang anthropologist, nakita ko po ito when I came to work in the NCIP. Yung pong approach ay iba, no? At yung community, iba din yung kanyang approach, no? And dito yung example po, no? Sila Pagusara, dinescribe nila yung ili doon sa Kalinga as a concrete concept and practice of community development and self-determination, no? So nandun na sa ili lahat. And dito po sa Central Luzon, no, yung mga katutubong Aita, yung 6 na language groups ng mga Aita, yung 3 language groups ng mga Dumagat, yung Agta, yung Alta, no, yung mga Kalanguy at mga Ilongot, masasalamin din po yung kanilang konsepto ng indigenous development. And in the next slide, no, importante po sa amin yung pong pagpaplano ng mga ganito dahil talagang dito po napapalabas yung pong kanilang perspektiba, no, sa kaunlaran. And sa NCIP, at least in Central Luzon, I am leading po. I am the regional focal for the Ancestral Domain Sustainable Development and Protection Plan. And we make sure na masundan po namin in the next slide yung pong maayos na indigenous planning system, no. Importante po sa amin sa ginagawa namin yung pong adequate community consultation, no. Meron pong talagang participation, malalim na participation yung mga katutubo, yung mga nasa community, yung community working group from the very beginning, no, hanggang sa pagtatapos po ng mga projects or ng mga ginagawa po natin ng mga pagpaplano. Meron pong need for planning, naintindihan nila, no? Naintindihan nila bakit kailangan magplano. Kasi yung iba pong communities, meron pong ads TPP or meron pong mga community plans pero hindi po nagagamit, no? Ibig sabihin baka hindi naman talaga kailangan magplano, no? Or kaya naman hindi pa na-realize or naintindihan yung pangangailangan na magplano. Meron pong maayos na preparation, adequate preparation, no? Prior to the planning, including evaluating the needs, yung mga tasking, very important po yan. Nag-shift na po kasi ngayon, no, si NCIP from being the researcher, ibinibigay na po yan doon sa mga katutubo, which is gano'n naman talaga dapat, no? IPs as researchers themselves, sila po yung may main task doon sa mga community development activities po na ito. Of course, the role of the elders, no, and the leaders are respected, especially sa mga communities po namin dito. Malaki po yung sinasabi, no, ng mga matatanda, ng mga elders doon po sa pagpaplano, lalong-lalo na po dito sa Pampanga. Malakas po ang kumbaga boses, no, ng mga matatanda, ng mga leaders dito sa Pampanga. Inclusive planning, alam na po natin yan, kasama po yung lahat ng sector. And then participants are united and cooperating. Mahirap po kasi kapag hindi po nagkakaisa yung community. Though wala naman pong perfect na community. For instance, dito sa amin sa CAT 025 sa Mabalacat at Mabalacat and Bamban, Tarlac, yung CAT na ito o yung ancestral domain na ito, malaki po ang issue, no? Sa marami pong conflict sa loob, maraming factions sa loob ng community, but we are trying our best to unite the people through participatory approaches po, no, ng mga pagpaplano. And mamaya po madadaanan natin yung CAT 025, ano po ang currently ginagawa, ano yung strategy na ginagawa ni NCIP. Indigenous rituals, of course, no, iginagalang, kasama po yan, integrated po yan doon sa proseso ng pagpaplano at ng lahat ng mga ginagawa natin sa community. And that the planners, no, especially yung mga assistors like the NCIP are being culturally sensitive doon po sa kanilang kultura. The next slide, gusto ko lang i-share ito kasi minsan po parang nagiging nagiging listahan, no, yung pong ads TPP. Mahalagang community development tool ito. Mahalaga po ito na dokumento, no? And we advocate palagi that land is life kapag IPs ang pinag-uusapan. And makikita po dyan, no, interrelated, no? Land is an integral part of the lives of our IPs, and it defines the lifeways, the culture, the identity, and the overall well-being of the IPs. And this relationship is like one entity, no? Inseparable talaga sila. Land is not only biophysical, but it is also social-cultural and spiritual. And dito po sa paggawa namin ng mga development plans, make sure, no, sinisigurado po na nare-reflect ito pong principle po na ito. Yung pong intergenerational responsibility, kailangan din pong makita ito, no, sa ginagawa po namin, especially sa pag-formulate ng mga plans nila. It's in the next slide, no. Sabi po niya dyan, isa yan sa mga operating principles ng ADS-TPP. And kung ADS-TPP yan, no, yan na po yung template talaga ng total community development nila. So, importante po na yung mga na pag-uusapan, no, sa loob ng ADS-TPP, for example, protection ng biodiversity, no, yung pong mga socio-economic programs na hindi po makakasira talaga doon sa kanilang sustainability, no. Ngayon po ang kulang, especially sa mga coastal communities namin, yung pong yung discussion, more of discussion doon sa coastal areas. Pero sanay na po yung mga katutubo natin dito doon sa mga inland, no, sa mga kabundukan na pagpaplano. Pero wala pa masyado doon sa coastal. At ito po yung wino-work out namin with our partners, no. Sa next slide, ito na naman, FPIC na naman, no? So importante po yan, lagi po namin sinasabi that the ADS-TPP, ito po ay pagsisimula ng discussion sa FPIC, no? It means that the IPs shall, within their communities, determine for themselves policies, development programs, projects, and plans to meet their identified priority needs and concerns, no? And sa ADS-TPP po, sa paggawa natin ng development plan, nare-reflect po ito, no? Meron po mga communities na directly sasabihin nila, hindi namin papayagan yung ganitong klase ng activity. For example, large-scale mining. Meron mga communities directly ilalagay nila na hindi pwedeng magkaroon ng dam, no, mga ganyan po. So nakikita po yan. And sa mga discussions po doon sa formulation process, nare-reflect po yung kanilang kagustuhan talaga, no, na yung pag-iit nila na kami naman yung masusunod, kami naman yung pakikinggan, no. By the way, I'm using actual photos po of our, lahat po na nakikita niyo mga photos dito, mga actual photos po yan ng amin pong mga fieldwork and community planning sessions with our communities. So, the next slide, more on the FPIC ulit. No? The acceptance or the rejection of a proposed policy program or plan shall be assessed in accordance with the following IP Development Framework Value System. No? So number 1 dyan, ancestral domain as the fundamental source of life. No? Number 2, traditional support system of kinship, friendship, neighborhood clusters, tribal and intertribal relationships rooted in cooperation, sharing, and caring. Number 3, sustainable and traditional agricultural cycles, community life, village economy, livelihood activities such as swidden farming, communal forests, and hunting grounds, watershed irrigation systems, and other indigenous managed systems and practices. Sinasabi ko po ito kasi ito po yung nakikita namin sa mga communities, no, at least in Region 3. And I would say kahit po sa ibang mga regions, no, sa mga discussions po namin, nasasalamin po ito. Kailangan po yung pag-consider nila kung i-reject o tatanggapin nila ang isang programa, ipapasok nila doon sa kanilang plano. Ito, isinasaalang-alang po ito mga ito, no? Mga properties, house, sacred and burial grounds. And marami po lumabas na mga issue. Halimbawa, kahit po yung mga daan, no? Kahit yung mga daan na ginagawa, siguro naman po nabalitaan ninyo yung nangyari doon sa Sagada, ano? Nagreklamo yung mga katutubo dahil yung binoboldoser ng DPWH sacred grounds daw pala. Sabi po ng guidelines natin, hindi po pwede sanang galawin yung mga ganyan, no? So dito po makikita natin, no, ongoing po ang community mismo, ang mga leaders mismo, sila po yung nagpapahayag ng mga ganitong mga pagtutol, no. At lahat po ito, no, ini-embody ng ADS-TPP. Opo, wala po talagang Prof. Lea, wala po talaga kasi kaming ibang focal point pagdating sa community development, hindi yung ginagawa po namin sa mga ADS-TPP, ano po. Okay, sa next slide po, yan. Lagi din po namin itong sinasabi at sinisikap na mai-reflect sa mga ginagawang pagpaplano that ecology, no, yung tinutukoy na ecology sa language ng IPRA at ng mga relevant guidelines is not just biophysical. This is the photo of the glimpse lang po ito ng ancestral domain ng mga alta dito sa San Luis, sa Maria Aurora, San Luis Aurora. And 2000, it was 2017, bumaba po ako dito. We started doing, formulating their ADS-TPP. At yung isa nilang drawing, yung matanda, nag-drawing po siya nung doon sa kanyang pangarap na maunlad na pamayan ng katutubo. Nag-drawing po siya nung parang malabo na image ng isang agila. And then hindi po nila pinermanent yon, parang blurred lang siya. And nung pinapresenta nila yon, nagtanong po ako, sabi ko, parang nakalimutan niyo pong kulayan yung eagle or yung lawin. And then sabi po nung matanda, ay hindi anak, sabi niya, ganyan talaga yan. Kasi yan yung spirit na hindi namin nakikita, looking over, hovering over our ancestral domains, protecting our ancestral domains. So sa mga ganito pong klase ng engagement with our communities, we see na yung pagtingin nila sa kanila pong sa kanilang biosphere, sa kanila pong tahanan or ancestral domains ay napakalalim talaga. No? Hindi na lamang ito biophysical, but pati po yung spirituality nandyan na, yung metaphysical kasama na rin po dyan. Yan po yung brand ng development na ini-embody natin or gusto nating i-embody in the ADS-TPP formulation or in any other development programs na papasok sa loob po ng ating mga ancestral domains. The next slide, this is just a glimpse of the components nung pong ADS-TPP. Mukha lang po siyang maikling mga sanga, pero ini-expand po yan, mahaba po, marami pong laman yan. You will see in the ADS-TPP, the ancestral domain and community situationer, the development and protection plans and programs and implementation policies and schemes. Now, some would say na outdated na po ito, Well, that is actually true. Ito po ay halo pa doon sa sinasabi noon ng UNDP, na present with the UNDP. And meron naman na pong mga steps to update, the contents of the ADS-TPP depending on kung sino yung kausap ng community as kanilang partner. Kasi pwede naman po makipag-partner ang isang community in the formulation of their ADS-TPP. And as I have said kanina, there are indigenous communities, merong coastal areas, pero wala silang discussion on how to protect, how to sustainably develop yung po mga coastal areas. So yun po yung mga nakikita pa nating kakulangan sa pagpaplano sa loob po ng ating community. So bilang concrete example, the slides that you are going to see, ito po mga susunod na slides, ito po yung actual na nangyari doon sa mga dumaget. Dumaget po kasi yan ang pronunciation nila. They are commonly known as dumagat, yung ascription by others, but pag nagsalita po sila, dumaget kasi yung kanilang pinopronounce. So ito po yung actual na experience namin. The dumaget indigenous cultural communities po in Dingalan, in Aurora, describe their journey in the formulation of ancestral domain sustainable development and protection plan as MAEDUP. Nakakatuwa po yan. Sila po ang nagbigay ng pangalan, MAEDUP. And paulit-ulit po yung lumalabas sa discussion. The term literally means live or to live, to remain alive, or mabuhay nga, sabi ko po kanina. By the way, ito pong mga dumaget na to, mga Tagebulus po ito. Tatlo po kasi yan na malalaking language groups na mga dumagat. Tagebulus, Edimala, and Gabolowen. Depende kung saang lugar mo sila pupuntahan. Ito pong photo na to, ito yung kanilang community working group na tinatawag. Sila po yung nag-lead doon sa formulation ng kanilang ADS-TPP. And they explain that it best captures their aspirations and pursuit for the total community development, not just to survive, but to remain alive, in their cultures and traditions for generations to come. It also embodies the richness of the biodiversity found in their ancestral domain and ancestral waters, and the delicate balance of their ecology. The CWG po, acting as IP researchers, was formed in 2017, and the community started their planning process the same year. And today, as we speak, their ADS-TPP is nearing completion already. So mahaba pong proseso ang pinagdaanan talaga. Imagine 2017 pa po sila nagpaplano, ano po. Kasi we also believe in the principle na development according to their own pace and manner. Though, syempre, may budget constraints kung pinag-uusapan, kaya din po may ganun katagal, no? Nag-interface po sila, no, with government agencies dito, particularly the local government unit. Sa next slide, makikita po ninyo yung mga pinagdaanan nila, no, mga documentation process. It answered ano lang naman po, 3 guide questions, no. In community development planning, 3 guide questions lang po yung gusto namin itanong sa kanila, no. Ano ba yung kondisyon ng kanilang komunidad sa kasalukuyan, no? What do they want to achieve? Second, and third, how will they be able to do it as a community, no? So, the ancestral domain situationer would answer for the first question, no? Yung first component pala. What is the condition of their community? Yun yung first component. So dito po, no, pinag-uusapan yung biophysical component, no. Yung mga workshops na yan, puro patungkol po yan sa kanilang ecology, biodiversity, no, yung mga anyong lupa, mga anyong tubig, lahat-lahat po yan. Sila po ang nag-describe. Even yung pong seasonal calendar, lagi po namin, personal favorite ko po talaga yung seasonal calendar. Makikita natin doon yung pong yung kanilang pananaw, no, doon sa panahon na nakabase doon sa kanilang agricultural cycle, no, sa kanila pong hunting cycle, etc. etc. And ito pong component na to, dito rin kasama yung mga development needs and challenges. Lumalabas na po dito, no. It highlights the needs, the problems, and the concerns to fully develop the ancestral domain. And it also identify collective or community traditional capacities used to either protect or claim the rights to their ancestral domains and rights. Mahalaga po ito dahil kung yung LGU halimbawa, meron silang tinatawag na mga zoning. Sa pagpaplano po ng community, meron pong mga traditional indigenous land use patterns. So pag nag-drawing sila ng mapa, hindi lang sila nagdo-drawing ng mapa or naglalarawan ng kanilang ancestral domain. Pero dito po marire-reflect na din yung kanilang indigenous land use patterns, no? Yung disposition ng lands within the communities, bounded by their customary laws and practices. And makikita mo din dito, naturally sa mga discussion lalabas po yung kanilang innate capacities to develop, di ba? Kasi ang notion dati, kaya mag-ads TPP kasi hindi nila kayang i-develop o protektahan yung kanilang lupa. But it's not true, no? Kaya sila nagpaplano para i-dokumento lang kung ano na po, una, yung existing na ginagawa nila to protect their ancestral domains and lands and waters, di ba? So mahalaga po yan na component. The next slide, yung next slide naman po, no, yung kanilang second question, no, what do they want to achieve? So pagkatapos na mapag-usapan, doon sa first phase, sa first part, yung kanilang kalalagayan, mga sitwasyon at pangangailangan at mga traditional na mga capacities. Pinag-usapan nila ano yung gusto nilang ma-achieve. No? So dito po medyo nagiging technical ang mga usapan. May mga assistors po sila, primarily the NCIP. No? It specify plans and programs, no, to meet the identified needs of the community and the ancestral domain. This is a spatial, no, development programs and plans which includes, no, pertaining to, among others, ancestral domain territorial integrity, forest and marine conservation or protection, or renewal, water security, pollution prevention, environmentally critical areas, commitment to maintain ecological balance, land utilization and management, and the socio-economic and human resources development. Notice that the socio-economic, nandun po yan sa list of priorities, no, sa pag ginagawang mga strategic plan. Nauuna pa rin po talaga dito, no, yung protection, protection na masalamin o makuha, no, makita, mabasa hindi lamang ng mga community members pero nung stakeholders or development partners na makakabasa or gusto makipag-partner sa isang indigenous community. Now, the next slide, no, yung last portion, nandyan naman yung paano naman nila ito gagawin. Kung nalaman mo na yung sitwasyon ng community, nakabuo ka na ng plano, no? May vision ka na dyan, meron kang gustong ma-achieve, so paano naman natin ito gagawin? No? So, ito naman yung, dito po lumalabas, no, yung implementation, policies and mechanism. No? As a basic component, this is the logical outcome no? A logical outcome after appraising the situation of the ancestral domain, assessing the development needs, conceptualizing the development framework, and identifying plans and programs for the fulfillment of the intergenerational and multi-dimensional well-being of the IPs, no? So, ayan po 'yon. The next slide, yan. Isa po itong halimbawa, no? Hindi po namin binabago. Kino-quote namin directly, no? This is the Dumaguete vision of development, no? Sabi po niya diyan, pangarap naming mga Dumaguete dito sa bayan ng Dingalan ang isang maunlad, maayos at mapayapang pamayanan kung saan kami ay nagtutulungan at may pagsisikap na mapanatili ang kultura. Pangarap namin ang isang pamayanang may edukasyon, maayos na kalusugan at maayos na bahay. Pangarap namin ang isang pamayanang walang balakid at kahirapan na aming mapagtatagumpayan sa loob ng aming lupaing ninuno. And if you go from one community to another, no, napakaganda po ng mga isinusulat nila at yan po yung nagiging basihan, nagiging angkla ng kanila pong priority na mga development programs and plans. And sa next slide, no, nagta-transition na po ako doon sa next topic, no, which is the development din. Nakabahagi po, no, yung mga IP youth naman natin, no. And IP empowerment, makikita po dito si Alaysa, isa po itong youth leader doon sa Dingalan. Very active doon sa formulation, no, ng kanilang plans. And kahit saang communities po, meron talagang mga IP youth, no, and even IP women na malakas yung kanilang participation. Makikita mo yung kanilang role doon po sa pagpaplano, no. And ito pong article na to, siya po ang sumulat niyan, no. Inilalarawan niya yung naging process, yung naging experience niya doon sa kanilang development planning doon po sa Dingalan, no. Sabi niya, nakikita namin ang kakulangan, ang papel naming mga kabataan ay makinig at makialam sa mga usapin ng pamayanan. Habang bata pa kami ay mahalagang makiisa na kami sa paglutas ng mga suliranin. At sabi niya, naniniwala akong mahalaga ang NCIP sa pamamagitan ng NCIP. Huwag na sana naming maranasan ang dinanas ng aming mga magulang, no? So yan po yung unang bahagi. If we can go to the next PowerPoint, matatapos na po ako, promise. Konti na lamang po ito. And I hope meron po tayong napupulot kahit paano. Ayan. So I will end the discussion with what we are doing doon po sa IP Youth kasi natapos yung isang slide with the IP Youth. Then ito po yung ginagawa namin sa mga IP Youth ngayon, no? Wait lang po. Ayan. So can we go to the third slide? Third slide po tayo. Ayan. So ang focus po nitong itong presentation na to, yung CADT 025 dito po sa Pampanga, particularly in Mabalacat and portion niya nasa municipality of Pampanga. So matagal na pong pinuputakte ng issue ang ancestral domain na ito simply because ito po yung ancestral domain na nag-overlap or nasa loob ng Clark Freeport Zone, Special Economic Zone ng Clark. So marami pong issue dito. Siguro yung iba po napanood nyo na sa TV, napanood nyo na, nabasa nyo na, no? Kung ano po yung mga burning issues dito sa CADT na ito. So ito po yung pangangailangan. Sa next slide, makikita po yung need for Ancestral Domain Sustainable Development and Protection Plan, yung kanila pong Investment Plan for Health. Nasa next slide po yon, yung kanila pong Royalty Management or Wealth Management. Hindi pa po documented ang IPS-IPO nila. Wala pa pong kumbagang maayos na governance, no? Hindi pa po yan nai-establish. Though traditionally meron naman po, pero punong-puno nga po kasi ng conflict. So ang amin pong strategy na ginawa, no, sa next slide is gusto ko pong ituon yung attention doon po sa empowerment po of the IP youth and employment of the new technology. Mamaya po ipapakita ko, no, i-share screen ko yung actual na data namin dito. So meron pong sa mga susunod na slide, nakikita po yung mga capacity building with the NCIP with the use of the technology and particularly yung sa GIS, no. Ano lang po ito, makabagong approach lang sa community development, no, community organizing. And meron po kaming kapartner, no, isa rin pong anthropologist, si Mr. Anghag from the GIZ COSIRAM. And napili po yung mga kabataan, no, sa next slide because yung pong kanilang kakayahan na mag-adapt doon po sa mga bagong teknolohiya po na ito, no. And we are preparing them, no, this commission is preparing them kasi nagki-create na po kami talaga ng mga pool of IP researchers, no, na gagawa ng susunod na mga activities or mga magli-lead sa mga susunod po na mga development programs. And we introduced the COBO technology for IP research. It is an open source tool for mobile data collection. I don't know if some of you here nakita na po ito, na-encounter nyo na po itong COBO technology na ito, no? And yan po yung mga nag-develop, no? Yung OECH, yung Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and the International Rescue Committee. Sa ano po yan, sa UN. And we decided na mag-collect ng data, mag-research gamit po ang technology na ito, especially ngayon na pandemic po, no? Kasi it is much faster, it is much more accurate, and it is optimized for humanitarian work. And since free-source po ito, wala po itong bayad, no? And I believe si NCIP pa lamang po, particularly Region 3, yung gumagamit nito. Nasimulan po ito sa mga katutubong manobo doon sa Mount Apo. Nagamit na rin po nila ito, no, in capacitating their community while at the same capacitating their IP youth at the same time, no, formulating their ancestral domain sustainable development plan and their community royalty development plan. So sa next slide po, ito po yung itsura ng COBO technology na ginagamit po namin sa IP research ngayon. Ayan. COBO Toolbox kung Android, GIC Collect kung iOS ka naman. And we started to organize the youth earlier of this year. Sa next slide, no, nakapag-training po sila. Mga kabataan po ito at ang gamit lang nila yung smartphone po nila, no. Yun lang po ang kailangan nilang dalhin sa mga trainings po na ito. Sa mga next slide, mga photos lang po yan ng mga training, actual trainings sa paggamit po ng kanilang ng COBO technology na ito sa smartphone nila. Sa next slide, yan, ito po yung ginawa, no? Naturuan natin sila sa mga community organizing skills, naturuan natin sila yung mga basic ng ethnographic research, nabuo po yung kanilang dataset, no, sa kanilang census of population and household, gamit po yung COBO Toolbox technology po na ito. Sa next slide, mga photos pa din ng mga trainings po nila, no? Nakapag-develop po sila ng sarili nilang mga sets of questionnaires. Imagine, no, yung mga kabataan po yung nag-develop, mga IP mismo yung nag-develop ng kanilang questionnaire, no, for their own research. Yan, sige po, tuloy-tuloy lang. Yan. Yan po yung mga screenshot ng COBO database. Ipapakita ko po mamaya. Sige po, tuloy-tuloy lang. Alright, mga practicum nila. Kasama po namin ang dito ang Clark Development Corporation. No? So, meron pong 21 sitios, no, sa loob ng CATI 025 na ito at bawat sitio, meron pong mga IP youth researchers na na-erase up po tayo na gagamit or gumagamit ngayon nito pong technology po na ito. So kabahagi na po sila. No? Nasabi ko po kanina na punong-puno po ng issue itong community na ito and mayroon pong mga awayan sa mga leadership. So naisip po namin na simulan natin yung pong pag-usad ng community development sa mahabang panahon na hindi umuusad sa pamamagitan po ng mga katutubong kabataan, no? Na willing at maititrain sa pagre-research. Next slide, makikita nyo po dyan. Yan, nung na-training na po sila, dineploy po namin sila. Ang gamit lang nila yung kanilang smartphone. Kahit walang internet, gumagana yung kanilang COBO app. Kahit walang internet, gumagana po yung kanyang GPS, no, yung positioning system kasi satellite naman po yung COBO. Sige po, sa mga next slide. Makikita natin yung mga kabataan nagre-research. Ang kagandahan po nito dahil community-based naman, hindi na po nila kailangang umalis pa. No? Nandyan lang sila sa community kahit gabi. Mapuntahan lang nila yung mga malalapit na mga kapitbahay. So, naikandak po yung kanilang research. Sige po, tuloy-tuloy lamang po. Yan. So minimal supervision po si NCIP. No? This is truly empowering kasi po, ayan, can we pause there? Yan. Truly empowering kasi minimal supervision po kami dito. Every single day nakikita lang namin yung progress nila kasi database naman po ito. Basta may internet, makapag-submit sila ng data nila, no? Kung ilan yung kanilang na-gather on that day, then nakikita po namin yung kanilang progress. No? So the Kobo Toolbox is very powerful kasi po equip po ito with GIS, no? Meron pong integration ng photo as part of the documentation and may automatic po na data tabulation and analysis, no? And of course, yun na nga, sabi ko po kanina, merong real-time monitoring. So sa next slide, ayan, so if I may be allowed to screen share, matatapos naman na po ako. If I may be allowed to screen share, I just want to share po yung actual na database. Okay lang po ba? Okay, this is the, nakikita po ba ninyo? Yan. I think interesado po dito yung mga researchers, ano po? Yung lalo na po tayo sa academic community. So this is the official census form. I have the authority to share this information, no? This database nila ng community na ito. So yan po yung total submissions as of today, 773 forms. At dito po makikita natin, no? Sasampulan ko lang po, no, yung data. Since automatic po na pumapasok sa amin yung pong mga datos na to, nag-generate na rin po si Kobo, no, ng tabulation. Yan. Siyempre consent, mahalaga po yan. So sasampulan ko lang po, ano. So gamit lang po, imagine gamit lang cellphone ng bata, ng kabataan, then isesend lang niya, no, kapag may internet na siya ulit. Pag may internet signal na siya ulit. So tuloy-tuloy lamang po ito na nangyayari at tuloy-tuloy din na pumapasok dito po sa kanilang database. So halimbawa po ng tanong, ano? Ayan. Ano ang pinagkakakitaan o hanap buhay ninyo, no? So dito po, no, out of the 773, no? May nagsasabi po na 60%, 61% ay gahak or traditional farming systems pa rin po ang kanilang kabuhayan. No, so ganito po ka-powerful ngayon yung kanilang research, no? At nag-transition po kami ngayon para i-train sila na sila rin na mag-present nito. Kasi sila yung nag-develop ng kanilang mga research questions, sila yung nag-conduct ng actual data gathering using their smartphone, at later on sila din po yung magpe-present ng kanilang datos sa community, no? So yung pong mga data na makukuha dito, socio-economic data, political, no, cultural, and any other data na ipinasok doon sa kanilang form bago sila magsimula ay magagamit na rin po sa iba't iba pang community development planning like STPP, like CRMDP, yung investment plan for health, yung kanilang even IPMR, no, even FPIC, and even data needed for the IPS documentation and IP formation of their IPO. So marami po 'yan, no? Kita, health, no? Lahat-lahat po ng pwede nilang idagdag or gusto nilang itanong, nilagay po nila dito. So may access po sila dito anytime. Pwede po nilang makita yung data nila. So dati-dati po mahirap mag-generate ng data, no? Laging binabalikan yung mga mahabang mga dokumento, pero ngayon po sa isang click lang, no, empowered yung mga katutubo na mag-conduct ng sarili nilang data na ipasa, may technology transfer na tinatawag, at madali po sila makipag-usap doon sa kanilang mga mga development partners or stakeholders. Can we put back the slide po as I end the PowerPoint? Sige po. Ay, wait.
Don,
Ay, ma'am.
ibalik yung slide ni Kevin.
Opo.
Okay.
Yung IPUT po?
Yes po, yes po. Sige sir, I think pwede ako mag-share screen. Pwede po ba ako mag-share screen ngayon?
Yes, yes.
Sige po. Ako na lang po para diretso na to. Okay. Ayan. Nakikita niyo po ba?
Yes.
Ayan, so marami pong demographic information na nakuha na kami dito, no? Nakakailanganin po diyan sa mga nakasulat sa taas ng mga development plans and regimes, no? Community situationer, development of communities, and even the resource and wealth management, no? Yung sa CRM DP. So marami po siyang potential na paggagamitan, and slowly nagta-transition po, hindi lamang si Pampanga, pero we go from one ancestral domain to another para po i-introduce itong technology na to, i-empower yung ating IP youth, no? Kasama din po yung iba pang sector na gustong makibahagi doon sa IP researchers. So ang itsura po ngayon, no, IPs not as beneficiaries, not as a source of information, but IPs as prime movers, development partners, and researchers themselves, no, nung kanila pong mga datos. Okay. Ngayon po, kasalukuyang ginagawa ng NCIP, sa buong NCIP na po ito, yung pong SWOT analysis of the 36 IP rights under the IPRA, bilang bahagi po nung 24th anniversary commemoration ng passage of the IPRA. And we dubbed this project as 1,000 IP stories. We are using yung pong COBO, no, na introduce na po sa buong NCIP recently, yung COBO. At mga kabataan din po ang nagtitraining ngayon para mag-gather ng mag-interview, no, mag-conduct ng mga interviews using their smartphones. And by the way, hindi ko po na ipakita kanina yung pong COBO pala, no, dun sa database. Makikita po kung saan mismo nakuha yung information exactly, kasi meron po siyang GPS location, no. And at the same time, kung papayagan nung ini-interview, na-picturean din siya, no. Nakuhaan din siya ng photo, and pati po yung facade ng kanyang bahay. So there are various ways to validate, no, yung pong truthfulness, yung veracity ng mga data na naipasok doon po sa COBO, doon sa kanilang database. So ito na po yung ginagawa ng buong NCIP ngayon, yung pong 1,000 IP stories, and sa mga susunod po ng mga months siguro makikita na natin, no. Ito po ay parang ano po ito, pag-aaral kung ano po yung mga ano po from the perspective or from the lens of the IPs themselves, ano yung mga rights na na-fulfill, paano ito na-fulfill, no? Ano naman yung mga hindi na-fulfill, ano yung mga factors bakit hindi na-fulfill, and ano po yung kanilang mga recommendations, no, as we go along doon po sa implementation ng Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. So it is now being conducted sa lahat ng regions ng NCIP using this COBO technology. So mga photos lang po ito ng mga IP youth natin na nakasama doon sa research. And I think dito na po magtatapos yung akin pong presentation. Magandang umaga po at maraming salamat.
Thank you so much for presenting your work, Sir Kevin. I can't even begin to describe how informative, how enlightening, especially on community development, community research. I think we have a lot of questions to build on. So at this point, I'd like to thank all our speakers for their talks and invite us along into our open forum section for this morning's session. So we're currently accepting questions via Zoom and Facebook for all three of our speakers, and we actually have quite a few to start with. So to start, for Mamai was a comment on the trade-off between IP communities, their interests, and national or regional interests. So Wills Castro Palarca writes, the notion of a trade-off, especially with extractive projects that generate taxes and revenues for national and local development, are the same taxes and revenues that are utilized as transfer payments in the form of assistance and revenue sharing, including services to other local jurisdictions, including IP communities. They write that there are trade-offs between particular interests and the national or regional interests, and that competence should also include assessing trade-offs between interests of the IP communities and the national and regional interests. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Mamai.
Yes, I definitely agree that that is something that Indigenous peoples have to do. And this is precisely my point. Kevin's presentation is about highlighting indigenous competence that is not really captured by existing standards of competence. And I think that there are many other stories. Cordillera has a lot. Pampanga has a lot. And the thing is that if you think of it this way, indigenous people started at a disadvantage point. So they were behind in 1997. And then we had the IPRA, and then we had the NCIP, and now we have all these incredible projects helping them. And on top of that, indigenous peoples are also challenged to make this balancing act, to make this calculation between their local interests, their regional interests, and the national interest. And that is not even saying that they also have individual interests. Non-indigenous peoples do not necessarily have to make these calculations, but indigenous peoples are put in a position where they have to make these calculations. What is the need of the nation? Because IPRA is very clear on that too, that indigenous people's rights must be exercised within the framework of national integration and in aid of national development. So they also have to perform that function as citizen to help in building the nation, to help in pursuing national development. But then this is the tension. On the one hand, you have state-centric definitions of national development. Indigenous peoples have their own understanding of their own development, and they are empowered by the law to actually pursue their own version of development. How do you now harmonize these two? It's very difficult. And we can imagine that as indigenous peoples, the amount of competence, the level or degree of competence that it takes for one to actually calculate it well and come up with the best decision for themselves and for the nation is something that is on them. They are the ones who are going to have to make those decisions. And so it is definitely a demonstration of competence. Now, the difficulty is that there are indigenous peoples themselves who think that their natural resources must be used for profit. But there are also those who think that they should refuse and instead protect their natural resources because their ancestral lands are and their environment. These are the material basis of their cultural integrity. So it's not just a river for them. It's not just a mountain for them. These things under their ancestral domains are not just things that they can consume for profit. They have to think of something greater than that. And so that amount of introspection and that amount of calculation that you need in order to decide on what to do with the natural resources that you have is definitely going to be a test of competence. They have been called anti-development, or some indigenous communities, in fact, have been called anti-development because they refuse to share their natural resources. And some people might think that they are in fact restricting access, the ability to access and share these benefits for the greater population. But we have to also ask the question, who's going to live with the effects of the mines? Good for us non-indigenous peoples because we live in the cities safe from the harms of the mines, but they have to live beside the mines. It's in their backyard. They have to live with the consequences of having polluted river, for example, or polluted air. And all the physical harm that they can cause aside, these are also detrimental to their cultural integrity, which is something that probably the non-indigenous people may find hard to actually grapple with because it's just not in our lived experiences. So the amount of insight needed to make this decision is definitely incredible. And of course, our hearts go out for the indigenous peoples who have to make these decisions on a daily basis. The important thing that we have to understand is with the IPRA, they are now in a position to actually negotiate on equal footing and to claim fair or equal benefits. And if they have the competence to actually exercise their full rights under the law, this can all be settled. Their community can prosper, the nation can prosper. There should not be any tension between their cultural identity and the Filipino identity, because in the end, this is all about increasing our human potential towards building a nation that is actually one and the same.
Right. Thank you, Mamay. And I guess also understanding that decision that they have, understanding external pressure that might be on them. Sir Kevin, I wonder if you have anything to add to this about, IP communities having to balance their own interests and regional and national interests.
Thank you for that question. Kasi ano po yan? Yan talaga ang di-describe ko na tigmaan, lalo na sa baba. For example na lang, I am presenting to you, I just presented to you the ideal setup in formulating an ADS-TPP or the ADS-TPP. But the realities in the ground, sa mga experience namin, I've been involved ako sa, binibilang ko since 2014, 15 ADS-TPP formulations in the region. Kasama dyan palagi yung interfacing with LGU. And makikita mo dito yung resistance ng mga LGUs, sa ADS-TPP pa lang yan. And ang questions ng mga LGUs, pag may conflict palagi sa kanilang planning regimes. For instance, yung CLUP, Comprehensive Land Use Plan ng mga LGUs. Laging may conflict yung ADS-TPP dahil yung isang area na i-declare na sacred grounds ng mga IPs, kanilang land use pattern, posibleng gawing landfill ng isang LGU. So mga ganong klase ng conflict yan. So ano ang sabi ng guidelines? Sa ganitong mga pagkakataon na may conflict yung pong planning regime, yung ADS-TPP ng katutubo doon sa CLUP ng LGU, ang sabi ng guidelines, mananaig yung ADS-TPP ng katutubo. Pero ganun ba talaga ang kwento ngayon? Ganun ba talaga yon? Diba? Mukhang hindi pa. And meron pang resistance. Yun ang term na ginagamit ko to describe yung attitude ng ibang mga local government units pagdating doon sa igigiit din na development priorities or planning regimes ng katutubo sa pamamagitan ng kanyang ADS-TPP. Merong remedy doon sa HLURB guideline sa volume 3. For the very first time in 2013, ipinakita niya doon or binibigyan niya doon ng picture kung paano dapat ini-interface yung isang ADS-TPP, yung plano ni katutubo doon sa plano ng LGU. Pero 2013 pa yon, pero wala pa akong nakita or hindi ko pa na-experience dito sa region na talagang umupo si katutubo, si LGU, yung kanilang planning, at si NCIP para pag-usapan. At ang sinasabi nga doon ng guidelines ng HLURB, i-juxtapose. Okay? Actually, ang magi-interface daw, sabi ng guidelines, ay yung plano ni LGU sa plano ni katutubo. Ibig sabihin, merong supremacy, meron dapat ang tinitigyan, binibigyan ng bigat or ng weight ay yung ADS-TPP, yung plano ni katutubo. At least in the guidelines, yan ang sinasabi. Pero ibang istorya sa baba na po. Alam po natin lahat yan and sa experience namin. So nandyan ang bottleneck, nandyan po ang digmaan ngayon. And wala namang choice ang mga communities natin kung hindi ituloy lang yung mga ginagawa nilang plano and ipakita through tuloy-tuloy lang na coordination and dialogue with LGUs. Lalo na't nagpapalit-palit yung local chief executive. Nagpapalit-palit din yung council. So depende din kung sino kasi yung nakaupo talaga doon sa local legislative bodies. But the guidelines are clear. So far the guidelines are clear, ang merong primacy, ang merong weight, yung plano o yung perspective ni katutubo sa development over yung other planning development planning regimes.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. There are quite a few questions about like the legal basis of this. So for Sir Hendricks, regarding FPIC, would you agree that FPIC processes have been structured from the Western style of participation rather than the IP's worldviews? And what kinds of experience and education do IP lawmakers and planners need to help indigenize laws? Thank you.
Yes, actually yung concept na talaga natin ng FPIC is nakapattern naman siya doon sa it's on the draft declaration at least, no, and on international law instruments. So it is our concept of FPIC processes, hindi siya indigenized kumbaga. But I think it is dynamics, yung dynamism naman nakikita natin actually, 'di ba, from 2006. Si Ma'am Mai siguro is in the better position to say na there are amendments or there are changes on how do we conduct FPIC because of the challenges that our implementers might have seen on the ground on the implementation of the FPIC. Na yun nga yung sinasabi ni Ma'am Mai kanina na part ng kanyang study. As to the yung sa educational background ng ating mga gumagawa ng batas, no, we have to understand na ang nagke-create naman ng law talaga are our legislators, congressmen, senators, which are not necessarily well equipped when it comes to indigenous issues, no. But of course they have consultants naman, may mga ano naman dyan, may mga people behind them. And for example, our IPRA heavily patterned siya sa draft declaration on the UN DRIP. So they rely on those instruments, no. And yun nga and ngayon for example, no, let's just make an example sa Congress, ang head ng Committee on Indigenous Peoples are IP himself, our congressman, no. So kumbaga, I hope na makita natin kasi dito yun, no, yung sa Committee on Indigenous Peoples sa Congress, yung chairperson finally, 'di ba, is isang indigenous person yung nakahawak. Siguro kaya nga ako personally medyo nag-aano rin ako na mag-study, baka sakali mailapit natin, no, kasi kailangan, kasi hindi rin naman tayo kasi sabi nga natin mag-aaral lahat tayo ng batas. Siguro yung on our part, paano siguro tayo makapag-lobby, especially so na meron naman tayo ngayong tinitignan window of opportunity na makapag-lobby ng mga ganitong mga bagay doon sa legislators natin.
Thank you, Sir Hendricks. Going back to Ma'am
If I
Mai.
might, yeah.
Yes, please.
Yes, so this is the thing about FPIC. FPIC is contained in the 1998 Implementing Rules and Regulations. There is a guideline, and it's a set guideline, like you said, based on the UN Declaration, the draft at least. And then it was revised into the 2002 guidelines, but the 2002 guidelines was so difficult that there's hardly any FPIC that's been conducted using that policy guideline. So they had to revise it because it was too hard. And they came up with the 2006 guidelines. 2006 guidelines were so easy that mining communities flooded the indigenous people's communities. And more than 50% of all the FPIC applications were actually for mining in indigenous communities, an astounding number of them because it was too easy. And then it had to be revised. So they revised it again, and now we have the 2012 implement policy guidelines. And I happen to sit in the congressional deliberations for the 2012 guidelines. And the way that they tried to address the issue is to do a small scale, non-extractive activity. So there's a different FPIC for that, and a large scale extractive FPIC for large scale activities. So that's the way that they tried to make it easy for small scale and non-extractive, and more difficult for the large scale and extractive activities. But then again, there's so much frustration going on because for researchers, for example, it's very difficult to get an FPIC. You have to have funding to do the FPIC, and also a good number of months for you to be able to conduct the whole process. The thing is that although there may be some Western standards, because these are policy guidelines, these are bureaucratic procedures. So they have a step-by-step process, they have like timelines and reports. The IPRA itself actually also says that the FPIC guidelines should be in accordance with Indigenous customary laws. And it should be done in a language and process that's understandable to the Indigenous people. So there is room actually in IPRA to indigenize it and make it responsive to Indigenous people's needs. So although it started probably as more westernized because of all the bureaucratic procedures that you have to put in place to implement it, there is also enough room in the law as it is to indigenize it and make the Indigenous peoples apply it in their own case or within their own context.
Thank you, Mamai. There's another question regarding IKSP for Sir Hendrix. Ma'am Carmen Yangot writes, my interest was particularly piqued when you said royalties should be given to IP when IKSP is patented. My questions, should IKSP be patented? And if they are, to whom will the patent be awarded, to individuals or communities? I ask this because IKSP is by nature collective, and I'm not sure if intellectual patents can be issued to communities. Yes, Sir Hendrix.
Yes, actually, that's the main issue. If we look at it under intellectual property laws, under intellectual property law regime, mahirap. Hindi talaga siya pwedeng ipatent, even our marks, diba? Kasi kailangan either individual or corporation yung nag-register nito. So unless the indigenous communities will go as far as incorporating their communities and apply for patent and for marks. So that's why we're looking at other regimes other than intellectual property law regimes, because under intellectual property law regime as it is, mahihirapan talaga yung community diba na i-protect or kumuha ng royalties and all under that. That's why we're looking at yung mga other instruments like the Nagoya Protocols and other existing laws which provides that in bioprospecting or in extracting biological resources, this company through FPIC processes may come into a MOA. Not necessarily a patent po, no? Hindi po siya patent, no? And in under that MOA, royalties may be included in the terms and benefit as one of the benefit sharing, diba? Kasi sabi nga natin, your benefit sharing could be monetary or could be non-monetary, and I think that would already depend on what the community wants. Kasi some of the communities may not want to accept monetary benefits. And of course, we should respect that also. But it's not under our patent laws. It's not under our intellectual property laws regime.
Thank you, Sir Hendrix. This is a question directed towards Mamai from Facebook, but perhaps it's a question all of our speakers can contribute to. Nico Pakle writes, I would like to know what is the general view of IPs when it comes to the utilization of their non-renewable resources? Can you give examples of IPs who are pro utilizing these mineral resources and those who are against it? I think this can be a form of IP citizen competence.
Yes, of course. I can give you an example. So there are community-owned mines, for example, in the Cordillera, especially in Khadeeja, and they are running the mines themselves. So there is an Indigenous Peoples Organization. They have rules. They have a very sophisticated set of rules that include whether they should not use, for example, mercury or the conduct within the mines, who can go to the mines, benefit sharing. So these are all laid out pretty well. And so they are able to use their natural resources themselves, and they take control of the mines. So the benefits, the profits go directly to the community, and they have even listed all the things that they have gained from the mines. They now have good houses, they now have cars, they can send their children to school, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, they also understand that they have to take care of it, and they have a backup plan. So when they have exhausted the mines that are open now, they will stop, they will go back to agriculture, because they're also required to do ADS TPP. And again, this is a perfect demonstration of citizen competence. Who among us non-Indigenous peoples go to our community and plan an ancestral domain sustainable and protection plan that will not last just for 5 years or 10, but beyond generations? We don't usually do that. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples do that. they have to under the law. And so that's one example where their competence is really showing, because they took control of their own natural resources. They benefit directly from it. They're managing it themselves. They're policing it themselves. And also they have a sustainable development plan in case everything falls apart. Meanwhile, there are also a lot of indigenous communities where unfortunately, the natural resources have been depleted without any direct profits going to them. I think this is the more common story, and you can just Google or find the most recent studies on extractive resources, not just mining, but you can have, logging or building of dams or tourism ventures, tourism activities that have definitely hampered, the development within the indigenous there's progress, like in terms of money, maybe in terms of profit, but in the long term, these activities did more harm to the indigenous communities than good.
Thank you, Mamay. We have quite a few questions for Sir Kevin, starting with one about acquiring CADC or CALC. Ms. Joymi writes, we conducted an extension program in one ICC in Pangasinan. The group migrated to the area decades ago. When we were discussing IPRA, they asked us if it was possible for them to acquire CADC, CALC, or CADT. They're the first to occupy and develop the land, even though their occupation did not happen during pre-conquest. Should they be granted, and what is the process they need to undergo to officially acquire the land?
Thank you for that question, Ma'am Joymi. Yung pong ating recognition, delineation of ancestral domains ay very clear, no? Na yung pong pag-claim ng ancestral domain, meron siya mga basis kasi, no? Meron pong mga set of proofs na kinakailangan to, prove the since time immemorial possession of the land. Although wala namang binabanggit sa IPRA na clear na reckoning ano ba itong since time immemorial possession. But I'm afraid yung pong case nung mga nasa, saan po ito kasi? Season po ba? Sorry, Pangasinan lang, no? Ano
Yes,
po kayang particular group sila ng Igorot?
Perhaps Ma'am Joymi can add a follow-up comment.
Kasi meron din po kaming mga similar cases dito. They are Sama Bangingi and Sama Dilaut from Mindanao, and they would like to apply for a CAT-T or CAL-T. Kaya lang po, yun nga, no? Clear sa ating guidelines yung pag-prove natin ng since time immemorial possession doon sa lupa. Aguilar, Kankanay and Ibaloy. Okay. Merong mga ancestral domains ng mga Kankanay and Ibaloy in Pangasinan. But I'm not quite sure yan po sa Aguilar, no? And kung aminado sila kasi na recent lang yung pagkalipat po nila diyan, I'm afraid baka hindi mag-qualify for an ancestral domain kasi clearly defined yung definition po ng ancestral domain and even yung possession, no, ng ancestral domain po natin. And sa guidelines din, yung omnibus rules natin on delineation and guidelines, baka mahirapan sila doon sa pag-establish. Kasi yung elements of indigeneity, nandyan po yung connection sa land talaga, no? Though they are occupying the lands na ngayon, hindi siya kamuka nung, let's say for example, no, the Ibaloy of Southern Benguet. How do they connect to the land really? Paano nila tinitignan yung connection nila doon sa lupa? And yung iba pang processes ng delineation and guidelines natin, baka hindi po sila hindi nila mai-provide, no, sa ilalim po ng ating omnibus rules. But kapag ganyan, hindi naman sila binabawalan or hindi naman sila limited na para hindi mag-develop ng sarili po nilang community development plan. Actually, kahit naman po yung mga sinasabi nating migrant na mga IPs, no, for example dito po sa Region 3, kabahagi na rin sila ng mga existing ADS-TPP. Merong mga AITA doon sa lugar ng mga dumagat. Hindi nga lang sila makapag-claim ng land, no, kasi nasa loob sila ng ancestral domain ng mga dumagat, but they are included in the ADS-TPP ng buong ancestral domain bilang mga migrant IPs. And yung sa case nila dito sa Aguilar, I think, no, base po sa information na binigay ninyo ngayon, baka hindi sila mag-qualify to apply for a CADT, direct application po ng kanilang CADT. Ang maganda rin po tingnan dito, if they can still trace their ancestry or their roots in the Cordilleras. Kasi kung alam pa nila yung kanilang roots in the Cordilleras, ang treatment po kasi ngayon, no, halimbawa, ipoprove nila or mag-apply sila ng Certificate of Confirmation of ICC membership, tinitrace back pa rin po namin doon sa origin nila, no, doon sa pinanggalingan po nila. And clearly, kung sila po ay galing sa Cordillera, then hindi po Aguilar yung magiging lalabas na ancestry or pinagmulan po nila kung hindi po doon sa Cordillera.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. There's also a question about, they write, I'm delighted to see Indigenous women's participation or representation in your project. Does NCIP have guidelines or a set of standards on inclusive community development or programming to ensure gender equality, including Indigenous LGBTQ+ community?
That's a very timely question, relevant question, because it is also, I'm sorry for the noise, it is also embedded as an operating principle of the ADS-TPP, yung pong gender and development, no? Clearly stipulated dun sa guidelines natin na kasama po ito. That's why in the selection pa lamang, no, yung formation pa lamang nung tinatawag na community working group, hindi po, lagi namin sinasabi na dapat meron pong well represented yung mga sectors natin. And sa experience namin, sa totoo lang, talagang binibigyan ng mga indigenous communities ng ibang definition ng gender and development. Kasi ang pagtingin po natin dyan, no, very western no? Kapag hindi nakikita na nagpa-participate yung mga women doon sa actual planning, pwede natin sabihin ay less empowered yung mga IP women. But the truth is, kung bababa ka halimbawa dito sa mga AITA, mga abiling, mag-anchi, mag-andi, ambalain, magbakan. Sa formulation ng ADS-TPP, sila po ang nag-lead. Bakit? Kasi yung malaking bahagi ng discussion ng socio-economic, mga kababaihan po ang merong role. Meron pong mga pangunahin na ginagampanan, no, sa agricultural cycle, sa gathering, no, kahit sa pangingisda, mga kababaihan po lumalabas. So, hindi man sila nakikita doon sa sabihin mong pagpapatawag ng meeting, nakaupo ganyan, puro mga elders, mga lalaki pa. Pero doon sa iba pong processes sa community, no, and even sa loob ng household, lumalabas yung pong role, no, primordial role ng mga IP women po natin. And in fact, when Ma'am Leia, so that's the answer, no, to the question. Nandoon po yan sa mga ginagawa nating guidelines. Professor Leia asked about yung ginagawa po namin na IP Women Conferences dito sa Central Luzon. We do that because we want to highlight the role of IP women in community development. We've been doing this since 2018, and meron kaming mga pool of IP women resource persons. Ipinapakita nila, no, sa mga gatherings, sa mga activities namin, ano yung role ng IP women in education, in educating, no, passing on the IKSP to the next generation, yung role ng IP women in peace, no, peace building. Yan, kababaihan po ang nangunguna diyan, at least for Central Luzon. Ano yung role ng kababaihan pagdating sa governance, okay? And makikita po ninyo yung composition kung magbibilang lang tayo, no? Kasi ganito yan yung western style, binibilang ilan ba ang babae na IPMR, ilan ba ang babae na chieftain, no? Ilan ba ang babae na na member nung community working group natin sa pagpaplano, no? Binibilang palagi, and kalahati kababaihan kung gano'n natin gusto tignan. Pero more than that, yung bilang, yung meaningful participation nila na i-reflect at gusto natin i-highlight, no? Yun po yung ongoing ngayon. I think it's only Region 3 na meron po kaming sinusustain na IP Women Conference where the role of IP women in total community development is being highlighted. And itong taon na ito, kasama po namin si Bayang Barrios, no? Mayroon silang participation. And ganun pa din, no? Discussions, dialogue, pinapakita nila, sila mismo nagsasalita, no? Ano yung kanilang ginagawa, ginagampanan sa iba't ibang larangan, sa iba't ibang development thematic ng community development.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. I'm curious to look more into this dimension of gender when it comes to IP development. Mamay, would you say that your study on citizen competence can kind of be related to this idea of gender empowerment for IP communities?
Yes, it's not a particular focus of my study because it's an entire dissertation and it will take probably another 5 years. But yes, what I can say is that if you look at the Indigenous people's mandatory representation in Cordillera, and if it reflects also probably the situation in other Indigenous areas, there's hardly any women. So Indigenous people's mandatory representatives are usually selected. They're not elected. They're selected through customary norms and procedures, right? And most of those who are selected are men. So is this a problem? Well, if you are after number, it seems like a problem. But as Kevin said, if you're after meaningful participation, then it really is not a problem because there are so many aspects of life in the local community, where women participate more heavily than men. For example, in managing in their sustained ancestral development plan, in protecting their environment, in enforcement of their policies. So women are at the forefront of these activities. And also there is a changing composition of some Council of Elders in the Cordillera. So before, women are not allowed to become part of the Council of Elders, but there are some places, such as in Abra, where women are now allowed to become part of the Council of Elders, or whatever their version of Council of Elders is. And so this is a encouraging transformation and an encouraging trend, because it really gives recognition to the role of women in political representation, in policy making, in decision making, that is also built not only in the private domain, but also in the more public displays or the more public arrangements. So that's a good thing that we can also look at.
Yeah, that's a fascinating perspective on, just looking at the numbers versus, right, Sir Kevin, talking about meaningful participation, especially for women. There's a question here for Sir HENDRIX and Sir Kevin on special jurisdiction. They write, does the IPRA envision or even suggest that IP communities and their territories have the character of special jurisdictions? With their own laws, resource use regulations, like the Indian reservations in the US. I think this is like Native American reservations. If so, are we in effect endowing IPs with a special class of citizenship? If IPs are presumed, as indeed they are, to be full citizens, then they're expected to share in the benefits and costs of development like any other citizen. Perhaps we can start with Sir HENDRIX.
Okay, that's actually one of the questions raised when the constitutionality of IPRA was challenged in the Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources versus Isagani Cruz. They're saying that it's like giving them like an independent status, especially so that they have so much prerogatives when it comes to their ancestral domain, and they're challenging even the very idea of why do they have ancestral domain, because in the Constitution all public lands are owned by the state. That's your Gallian doctrine from your 1935 Constitution up to your 1987 Constitution. But the Supreme Court here ruled that, at least in the separate opinions, because in the main decision if you are following how Supreme Court decision works, mainly the ratio or what binds as law is the main decision, but the main decision only talks about the split of voting. So in the separate opinions, Justice Isagani Cruz actually had a heavy discussion on this, that actually no, it's not as if we're giving them independence or special kind of citizenship. It's just a recognition that actually the land that they own, they should have control over it because it is theirs. Not and we're not removing them from the public land because it has never become part of that public land. So it does not fall under the Regalian doctrine. And the idea here on why did the Supreme Court decide that way is because of the earlier decision of the insular government and your famous Mateo the Mateo Carino doctrine, which for that indigenous peoples, the concept of native titles. So it is as if, for example, this is just a parallelism. You own a parcel of land as an individual, like you have a control over that land. So why don't we give this to indigenous peoples? And interestingly, Justice Isagani Cruz also made a parallelism in his separate opinion about the IPRA and the situation of the political independence of the Native Americans. But maybe Justice Isagani Cruz did not imagine that many people or some people like whoever asked the question would be so interested about that parallelism. He did not go deep to that discussion, but he did mention that, but said that let's look at it in a case-to-case basis. So Justice Isagani Cruz did not really say that it's different, but if you look at their structure, it's different because as Ma'am Mai mentioned earlier, our indigenous rights still, or even our concept of development is still within the framework, within the national framework of development. Our laws still within the framework of our national laws. So you could just imagine national government agencies formulating rules, promulgating guidelines. So it's still the national government and it is still in accordance with our existing national laws, di ba? Kaya nga sa IPRA, ultimo vested rights, hindi mo na siya pwedeng i-disturb because that's part of the national law. So hindi naman ganoon yung ini-envision ng IPRA if we are to read the interpretation of the laws based on the opinions rendered by our justices when they decided the challenge on the constitutionality of the law.
Thank you, Sir Hendrix. Sir Kevin, do you have anything to add to that about this idea of special jurisdiction given to IP communities?
I totally agree with what Attorney Hendrix said. That's why ang pinag-uusapan lang autonomy, hindi naman total parang separation. Kaya nga yung ibang mga mambabatas very allergic sa term na territory. Kasi kapag ka territory, parang estado na yan, ano? That's why we sometimes, depende sa kausap mo, we do away with such terms. And in the Cordilleras, di ba? Autonomy lang naman ang pinupush. Hindi naman mag-separate ka. And the language of the IPRA. By the way, I agree also, no? Ito ang ina-argue pa ulit-ulit at kahit minsan yung mga nasa legal profession hindi rin madalas makukuha kaagad. That it was never part of the public domain. All right, ancestral domains were never part of the ancestral domain. These are private lands. These are private properties, communally owned. Yun lang ang pinagkaiba. These are properties communally owned. Nagkataon lang kasi talaga na lahat ng resources nasa loob ng mga ancestral domains. That's why ganito kabigat yung discussion na ito, no? If we will give them, by the way, ang sinasabi lang ng mga guidelines natin, they have they can exercise their priority rights, no? Doon sa mga resources within the ancestral domain, di ba? Hindi naman yan talaga ipagkakait totally. Pero syempre, nandyan pa rin yung mga relevant policies and guidelines sa FPIC. Kaya doon nanggagaling yung ganyang pagko-contest. And ang language ng IPRA, simple lang naman, no? Sinasabi lang niya talaga na since these are private lands, you have to respect. Hindi naman pwedeng papasok ka sa loob ng isang bahay na hindi ka kumakatok, no? There are set of rules, di ba? Na in place na dyan bago pa man yung pamahalaan ng Republika ng Pilipinas. Meron nang umiiral na mga customary practices and laws dyan na kailangan nating isaalang-alang, kailangan nating igalang, no? At hindi naman nun ibig sabihin totally different na siya. And by the way, sa IPRA, sinasabi din yung tatlong pangunahing responsibility ng mga katutubo, di ba? Papanumbalikin yung nasirang mga kagubatan, di ba? Yung ecological balance, and sabi niya doon sa ikatlo, susunod pa rin naman sa iba pang mga umiiral na mga batas ng Pilipinas. So hindi naman totally magse-separate. And yung iba kasi, yung iba din kasi tawag nila First Nations, no? Kung sa Canada ka, First Nations. It's a recognition that yun na nga, prior to yung mga gobyerno, no? Prior to the Philippines, talaga namang ano na to, nations na itong mga ito, organisado na talaga sila, no? Hindi lang talaga kasi na ituro sa kasaysayan po natin. So yun po ang pinanggagalingan natin dito, but it is not, no, I believe the intention of the IPRA para magkaroon ng special classification or citizenship para sa mga katutubo, hindi po.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. There's also quite a couple of questions about the community research plans you were presenting earlier. One of them is, how do you make that kind of data gathering tool and training available to local agencies and organizations or the general IP public for use for local community development?
Is that question for me? I'm sorry.
Yes, Sir Kevin.
Can you repeat that question, please?
Yes, no problem. The question was on the data gathering tool you were presenting earlier. They ask, how do you make this tool and the ongoing training for its use available to local agencies and organizations, or even the general IP public to use for local community development?
I'm excited to answer that question because the truth is, first time talaga ito, no? Sa NCIP at least, ha. I don't know if there are other organizations or entities doing the same sa pakikipagtrabaho nila sa NCIP. Pero kagaya ngayon, no, ipinapakita namin doon sa Clark Development Corporation kung saan kinakandak yung pioneering research na to ng mga katutubo kasi ancestral domain nila ang concern. For the longest time, puro salita lang, no? So ngayon pinapakita namin sa kanila, no? Pine-present namin recently sa kanila. Ito na po yung lumalabas na mga datos. Ito yung mapa, imaginein mo, very powerful, merong mapa. Merong GIS map doon sa Kobo Toolbox. Wait lang. For the sake of illustration po, no. Meron pa naman pong time, di ba?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Sandali lang po. Ano ko lang ito. Bahagi ko lang ito ng mabilis. Yan. I hope nakikita po ninyo. Nakikita po ba?
Yes, sir.
Ayan. Sige, full screen po. Yan. Yung mga dots na yan yung exact location ng kung saan kinunan nung IP youth yung data, no? This is the Clark development. This is the Clark Freeport Zone. This is the international airport here, and yan, ganyan lang kalapit, no? Yung ancestral domain ng mga katutubo doon sa economic zone na ito. This is the caldera of Mount Pinatubo here. So pinapakita namin ito sa kanila, no? Hindi naman kasi dati na-appreciate ito yung proximity. Sinasabi lang nasa loob ng Clark Economic Zone, pero for instance, pag meron kang visualization na ganyan, grabe, makita mo, no? Sobrang lapit pala talaga. And anything na gagawin nila dito, merong impact sa mga communities na nandito. Diba? So mga ganong klase po ng discussion yan. So pag-clinic mo ito halimbawa, itong cluster na ito, ganyan karami yung data na nakuha ng mga kabataan dito, no? Lahat yan, no? So kiklik mo ito, pag-clinic mo ito halimbawa, yan lalabas, no? Submission record 223 of 773. Ang pangalan ng in-interview niya si Julie Obiena Flores, and all other information. Yung labas ng kanyang bahay, nandyan nakikita mo. 'Di ba? So meron kang idea ngayon, no? Sa loob pala ng ancestral domain na ito, ganito na, no? Mix na yung type, no, ng ginagamit ng mga katutubo, at yung iba nga fully concretized na yung kanilang mga bahay. Pero yung iba, wala pa talagang concrete na mga bahay, no? So makikita mo yung ganung klase ng mga information. Pati yung photo niya, and yan yung photo niya, and even yung kabataan, no? Yung nag-interview, nakikita diyan. So nagiging hindi pa ito available sa lahat, no? Kasi tinatapos pa ito, kumaga pioneering ito. Kumaga ang stakeholder pa lamang na nakakakita nito is yung Clark Development Corporation. But imagine if the local government units of the Mabalacat, Angeles City and Bamban, makikita nila ito. Then hindi lang yung mga LGUs na yan, pati yung, for example, ibang government agencies, makikita nila ito. Mabilis na maipe-present namin yung data sa kanila kasi meron na rin mga tabulation yan, automatic na ginagawa yan nung Kobo toolbox natin. Then napakabilis ng discussion pagdating sa ano ang dapat i-prioritize. Kasi sa mahabang panahon, ang LGU magsasabi siya, magdadala siya ng proyekto, pero hindi naman yun nangangahulugan na yung proyekto kailangan talaga ng katutubo. Diba? Kasi perspective ng LGU yun Perspective yun. Kahit si NCIP, magpa-project si NCIP, pero baka perspective ni NCIP yan. But if you have this data readily available, no, in an instant pwede nilang i-present, then imagine, no, what the leaders can do. Kung gaano sila ka-powerful sa pakipag-bargain, sa pakipag-negotiate, kasi documented talaga yung kanila pong mga datos and information. And yes, available po ito sa kanila. They have access to these informations. Part po yan ng amin pong, part yan ng framework ng IP research kasi nga po, dapat talaga may control sila sa data na ito. And lalong-lalo na, sinabi ko kanina, itong mga areas na to, conflict sensitive ito. Conflict sensitive na mga areas dahil mayaman sa resources, no, at nasa loob nga ng Freeport Zone. So that, I hope na sagot po, no, yung pong question na to, and we hope to replicate ito pong ganitong approach sa iba pang mga katabing mga ancestral domain, no? At least dito muna sa Pampanga.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. Before we proceed with the rest of the questions, I'd just like to remind our participants that the link for the evaluation form is in our comments. So if you need a certificate for participating today, you can check the evaluation form there and fill it out. Adding to that question on this kind of community-driven research, there's also a question about how this kind of data can translate into advocacy or calls for action for decision makers. What are some of the strategies we can use to get responses from decision makers to look at data-based advocacy? And perhaps this is a question perhaps all our speakers can kind of answer to. With this kind of research you're all doing, how can we utilize all of that to get responses from the people in charge? Starting with Sir Kevin, perhaps.
Yeah, kanina inilalarawan ko na nga, pioneering dahil nga parang first time kasi ginagawa talaga, no, sa loob ng 24 years ng NCIP. And anong tawag dito? Paano siya maita-translate, no, into relevant policies? Syempre, importante po na ang nagdi-dictate sa mga policies natin mga tamang datos talaga, 'di ba? And example ulit, no, yung planning regimes ng LGU, CLUP, GIS na talaga ang mga yan, no? Geographic Information Systems ang ginagamit nila. And sa mga nakalipas na pagpaplano ng community, wala namang ganitong klase ng technology. Hindi available sa kanila o hindi na ita-transfer sa kanila. Existing na siya pero hindi pa nila ginagamit o hindi pa na ipapakilala sa kanila. With these technologies now, with this nag-GIS na rin sila, mas magkakaroon sila ng maayos na pakikipag-usap sa mga local government units. Kasi nga ang language ng planning ng mga LGU ay GIS. So kung meron na rin silang available na mga ganito na kayang i-generate, no, na mga information through GIS, through maps, mas madali na. Magkakaintindihan sila ngayon nung kausap nila, kasi dati ipe-present yan sa LGU. Lagi kong binabagit ang LGU kasi sila talaga yung unang-una na stakeholder, no, na dapat pumansin dito sa mga katutubong ito. Jurisdiction din kasi ng mga LGU sa mga ancestral domains na ito, at nandito talaga yung bottleneck, nandito yung totoong digmaan dito sa local, no, sa local government units. So kung magiging at par, no, yung data ng katutubo doon sa planning regime na naiintindihan ng isang LGU, then we pwede nating i-assume na baka sakali, no, mas madali na lang yung proseso ng pagpapaliwanag bakit kailangang ideklara ng katutubo itong areas na to as sacred grounds, as hunting grounds, etc., etc. So yun ang relevance nito nito pong ginagawa natin ngayon na pagbabago ng strategies in approach in community development planning by, no, empowering our IPs as researchers and development partners.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. Mamai, I'd be curious to hear your own thoughts on this.
These information gathering tools, of course, are very, very important, no? And now that we have them, we might as well use them to their maximum. The thing about putting them in an advocacy strategy is that sometimes legislators have their own language game. So, and they are also driven by goals. So unless you can connect the strategy or the tool to a specific goal, they sometimes kind of neglect it, or they just don't pay any attention to it. So the idea is really to build the language so that legislators, decision makers, policymakers can incorporate this in their actual policies. And this is also the reason why I have devised my framework, because it's beautiful to say that we are pursuing Indigenous people's empowerment, their self-determination, or citizen competence, but these are difficult concepts to actually realize and to actually understand. So what I would like to see is to reframe the language so that these strategies, these interventions can be connected to an opportunity, an ability, and a motivation. So what I'm saying is that if you have this amount of information, this is a perfect case where you can actually create the opportunity to share information so that people will be more informed, and then they can deliberate more competently. And this also increases their ability to do research, their ability to talk to other people, their ability to know their neighbors, their ability to actually just simply empathize with other people who may not share their own lived experiences. And then finally, the motivation factor, which is very important, because if the strategy or if the technology is removed from the daily experiences of the citizens, they won't be interested in it. But if you can say, this is actually very meaningful to you, this is useful for you, then you can create the motivation for them to do it, and they can also take ownership of that technology and that intervention strategy. So if we actually use this language in order to create the urgent need for this information to be shared, to be debated, to be assessed, and to be applied in the daily lives of our Indigenous peoples, then we can get the end goal, which is empowerment, which is citizen competence, which is self-determination, without necessarily having to use those terms, because those terms sometimes, turn off policymakers.
Right. I'd just like to check, because it's currently past 11:30, if all our speakers are comfortable with answering some more questions. We still have quite a few. All right, I'm so glad to hear that. So I'd like to ask Sir HENDRIX about this too, because of course you were talking earlier about transforming international laws into local legislation. For people who are really invested, for example, in biopiracy laws, what can they do to kind of put pressure on lawmakers to do this? What can they do to kind of advocate for these causes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Is very timely. It's very relevant. Election is forthcoming. We can check on the agenda of our that's one of the most practical way really to do this is to check on the agenda of our candidates, from local legislators to our senators, because So by far, nobody's really talking about indigenous people's legislation. So, but we are a chunk of the society. We vote. Di ba? Sabi nga si Ma'am Mai nga, di ba? Ang mataas ang voters turnout natin, and we should really be maximizing these opportunities talaga to forward our advocacies. Simply, di ba, sabi ko nga, there are different ways to do it, pero check on the agenda of our candidates, and of course, there is also constant lobbying from our civil societies and from our people's organization, and we have different ways of advocating it. But for now, I think the most important event, or the most important phenomenon that we could really maximize is the forthcoming election. We should ask our candidates what's their take on this, or at least if they have not thought about it, then maybe we can suggest this.
Thank you, Sir Hendrix. When we were talking earlier about the trade-off that IP communities have to think about when they're balancing decisions between their own interests and national interests, a question came in about putting the burden on the IP, given that IP history and capabilities have been erased by way of settler colonialism. Isn't there a restorative justice that needs to happen here? Perhaps Mamai can answer that first.
Yes, and that's the whole point of IPRA, to correct the historical injustice, right? But people are getting frustrated and they're saying, what has happened after 20 years? Why is FPIC like this? Why adds TPP like that? Why have ancestral domains been penetrated by corporate interest? Why are indigenous peoples not practicing their indigenous traditions anymore? And so on and so forth, right? So the thing I think is to understand that to restore the indigenous peoples to their rightful status and strength as indigenous peoples before colonization, or before they were marginalized and oppressed for so long, will really require a lot of time. And not only that, it will require a lot of complex policy network, which IPRA is actually providing. And the thing about having this complex network of policies and guidelines is that they will become conflicting at some point. No? So there's also the problem of legal pluralism, as you probably know, that because there are multiple legal orders that are out there. You have the national law, you have the local law, you have international law, you have IPRA, you have DNR policies, you have the Regalian Doctrine. These laws can sometimes be very, very conflicting with one another. So harmonization is usually seen as a way to deal with them. But more than that, I think, and I go back to the notion of competence, that indigenous peoples and even non-indigenous peoples, citizens in general, should be competent to navigate our political world, our political system, our community competently. And by that, I mean, they should know the laws and what is expected of them, and how they can use these laws in order to promote their interest without also neglecting the interest of the nation or their fellow citizens. So to me, that's actually the more important lesson here. Restorative justice is it probably will require another century for us to actually get to that place. But in the meantime, what we have are these multiple legal orders that are coexisting. And our job as academics, as policy makers, as ordinary citizen, is to know these multiple legal orders and to stand up to people who take advantage or abuse these multiple legal systems to their advantage without any regard for the human rights of their fellow citizens.
Thank you. And Sir Hendrix, would you have anything to add to that question on restorative justice?
Yeah, I think on the restorative justice, that's the importance of the studies of like that of Mamai and Kevin. Like we have to check on the competence, because actually that colonial mentality still exists. That why do we ask this national, for example, the view of the national government the government versus the governed when it comes to matters pertaining to the lives that directly affect them. And we have to really be reminded that of the competence that these indigenous peoples have. And tignan mo naman, di ba, yung study ni Kevin, they're very much competent talaga to participate in policy making, data-driven policy making. Only if only, diba, our legislator would realize this and would see this, then siguro kahit papano yung restorative justice uusad na ano talaga. It's just really a matter of recognizing that these indigenous peoples have worldview. Yung worldview nila may not necessarily exactly the same as that of the non-indigenous, but their view is based on their experience, yung mismong buhay na isinasabuhay nila.
Yeah, Sir Kevin, would you agree with that? That in your work, you've kind of seen communities talk about restorative justice at all?
Tama po yan, no? Our term is correcting historical injustices, no? That our IPs suffered, no? Since time immemorial din, no? Well, may related question dito about from Sir Wills Castro Palarga regarding kung alam ba, no, ng mga local government units and concerned agencies yung indigenous land use patterns, because doon pa lang makikita natin, no, kung ang ating bang government ay geared towards, correcting historical injustices, kasi diyan nagsisimula yan. If for instance some LGUs hindi pa rin nila alam ano ba ang ancestral domain, no, hindi rin nila alam bakit kailangan merong IPMR sa kanilang local legislative council, then that's a problem, no? Hindi ko naman nila lahat, pero kung meron pa ring mga LGUs na hanggang ngayon ay ganyan, talagang merong question, anong nangyari after 24 years of Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, no? And maganda po yung sinabi ninyo dito, sir, no? Because sabi niya, as a land use planner, I think indigenous approaches to land use would contribute very much to fine-tuning land use planning. Well, in fairness to the DILG and the HLURB, yung binabanggit ko kanina, they tried, no, to incorporate. Actually, last chapter nga siya nung volume 3 nung HLURB, no, CLUP formulation. Last chapter, yung ancestral domains, in an attempt to, ipakilala siguro sa mga local government units na, hey, i-consider nyo din sa pagpaplano ninyo yung mga lupa ng mga katutubo and yung kanilang mga agenda, no, yung kanilang mga concerns. But in reality, sabi ko nga, nandun siya sa mga existing na guidelines. So, nandyan naman yan kahit naman yung ibang mga government agencies. They tried, no, they attempted to create their own IP framework. The DepEd has the Indigenous Peoples Education, right? IPED. Sinasabi nito na hindi lang naman yung alam natin na mainstream na approach ng education yung nag-exist. We also have Indigenous People's Education. Nandyan din yung joint management agreement namin with the DOH. Sinasabi nito na kikilalanin din naman ng Department of Health yung mga traditional healing practices for as long as science-based din, no, kayang patunayan sa science na beneficial siya. Yung mga nagpo-push ng economic development like the DA, gumawa sila ng sarili nilang framework. Nandoon yung 4Ks, yung DSWD gumawa din ng framework, no, etc. etc. Even yung laging may conflict, no, si DENR, meron din siyang framework on the IPs, no. All of this sa tingin ko sa hinabahaba po ng nilakbay ng Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, attempt ito to correct historical injustices. But of course, kung nararamdaman ba talaga ito, kung papunta ba talaga tayo doon, is another story. But at least, no, meron na itong mga safety nets, mga bagay na ito sa mga polisiya po natin in the local, no, sa regional, even sa regional and even sa national level. So, yeah, I totally agree na kaya kami sa NCIP, marami pong challenges, maraming laban kasi kung ang isang community service center na kagaya ko, nagpo-formulate kami ng Ancestral Domain Sustainable Development and Protection Plan, incorporating lahat ng mga sinasabi natin na correcting historical injustices, restorative justices, no, giving primacy to customary laws in matters, no, or in deciding, no, mga matters affecting community life. hindi na itatranslate talaga doon sa mas malawak po na audience niya, no? Unang-una na diyan mga local government units. To answer that question, sir, I believe na i-communicate, no, previously, pero hindi lang siguro na sustain po sa tingin ko kasi nagpapalit-palit ang nagpapalit-palit kasi ang ang administration, depende sa kung ano ang priority niya. So kung hindi niya priority si Katutubo, yun na nga, election na po kayo, no? Naghahanap ka ng mga politicians na mag-embody, mag-embrace ng indigenous people's agenda, pero mabibilang lang po siguro talaga sa daliri, no? Yun po yung take ko naman pagdating po dito sa correcting historical injustice na ito.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. There's also a question here for you. I just want to know if the NCIP were included in the economic development of the Green City, where some ancestral domains of our Aida groups in Tarlac were directly affected.
To be honest, I don't know. The reason why I said that ay baka hindi talaga kami naisama, no? Nandyan lang yan, kapitbahay lang namin yan, Clark Green City. Pero nung pumutok ang mga issues about may madi-displace na mga Katutubo, yung area kung saan sila located ay hindi na po siya part ng ancestral domain. Ang ancestral domain dito, katabi nung sinasabi ko kanina, yung sinasabi ko kanina na CADP 025-A, yung sa Mabalacat, portion ng Angeles City and Bamban Tarlac. But yung areas kung saan nagkaroon ng kaguluhan, mga issues, ay hindi po siya sakop ng ancestral domain. And we tried to communicate and matitrace yung kanilang mga ancestry dito sa mga nearby, mga katabi pong mga ancestral domains, including ancestral domains in Capas Tarlac. No? Malalaki po, ang tatlo pong malalaking ancestral domains ang nandiyan sa Capas Tarlac, katabi nitong Clark Green City na ito. And I think meron ding question about APECO, isa na namang economic zone, no? Hindi pa po tapos ang issue diyan, no? Obviously nasa loob yan ng ancestral domain po ng mga katutubong dumagat, no? Itong APECO mag-undergo po sila ng proseso ng FPIC kasi wala po talagang exempted diyan. But the story on the ground might be different, and matagal ko na ring narinig na mag-FPIC, but as of this moment, no, I cannot give a clear picture nasaan na ang proseso ng FPIC dito. And meron tayong maririnig pa rin na clamor from our communities sa mga areas ng Dilasag, Kasiguran, no? Yan yung mga areas kasi Dilasag, Kasiguran, ano pa mga areas ito? Mga nasa dulo na, no, ng Aurora, mga agta po ito, agta at mga dumagat, no. So yun po siguro ang masasabi kong update diyan. And in relation to their ADS TPP, we are finishing right now the ADS TPP of the agta in Dicadi, no. Dilasag, Kasiguran and Dinalungan, yan. Puro kasi letter D doon eh. So we started it, no, at ngayon po nasa phase 3 na sila doon sa strategic planning, no. And I'm sure kasi kausap po namin yung mga kasamahan sila Engineer Mark sa Kasiguran. Mahaba po ang naratibo ng ADS TPP nila. Ang isa sa mga naratibo yan tungkol diyan sa APECO, no. Bago naman kasi sila pumunta doon sa actual na pag-prioritize o pagpili ng mga development projects nila, mahaba po yung narrative na brought out nila diyan. Bakit kailangan magplano? Ano yung kanilang pinagdaanan sa mga previous na mga attempts para umunlad, no? At kasama po dyan yung discussion sa APECO. So I'm excited also doon sa documentation na lalabas doon sa ADS TPP po ng mga agta dito sa Dicadi.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. I think we can kind of proceed to our last question, which I'm going to pose to all our speakers before we end the session. I'd love to hear your final thoughts on what you can say about the current state of IP rights and development, and also what you hope to see in the future. What do you think is important for us to look at as we look towards perhaps another 20, 30 years of this kind of research? Maybe we can start with Sir HENDRIX, Sir Kevin, and finish with Mamay.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I believe that Indigenous people's movement in the Philippines has gone far let's give it to the movement, and let's give it really to the advocates, that we've gone so far from that from pre-IPRA to IPRA into all these issuances. We've gone so much far, but there's still a lot more to be done. So I hope that we continue the discussion, we continue the advocacy, and it's a recognition that, as has pointed out earlier, the injustice, the historical injustice, has been for very, very long, for centuries, if not decades. So it may take another century to correct all this historical wrong, but what's important is something is being done. And I hope that outside this forum, because right now we may be in a bubble, but outside of this bubble, the bigger question is what's next, really. So there, and I hope that as advocates and as Indigenous people's rights advocates, really, then we bring out the discussion outside this forum.
Thank you, Sir Hendrix. Sir Kevin?
Yep, I agree to attorney. Let's owe it po to the movement. And as far as the NCIP is concerned, 2 taon pa lamang po ang IP Masterplan. It's been, how many years before yung ganun ka-komprehensibong pag-aaral at pag-amin ng mga 14 major thematic concern ay malaki pong bagay, malaking step para matugunan yung mga burning issues po na ito. We recently launched Project Ipanaw. It's an ethnographies of our indigenous peoples. Nasa phase 2 na po kami ngayon, kung saan bawat katutubong pamayanan ay magkakaroon po ng kanilang ethnography. It's an ambitious project, but with proper guidance and funding, we hope to maipagpatuloy po yung journey sa pagkilala, yung sabi ng ipanaw namin, pagkilala, paggalang at pagtataguyod. The mere fact that we are doing this is simply because hindi pa po tapos ang laban, hindi pa tapos ang advocacy. Marami na pong gains, but marami pa rin pong kailangan gagawin na talagang dun sa level ng community mararamdaman po nila. We are now into papunta na po tayo sana doon sa time na ang magsasalita yung mga IPs talaga, hindi lamang ng mga issues, mga burning issues or historical injustice na sinapit nila, pero pati yung mga gains, na yung mga success stories ng kanilang mga communities. And we've been hearing a lot lately in Mindanao, in the Visayas, and even in Luzon, na sila mismo, mga organized na sila, meron silang mga ginagawa din na kanya-kanyang initiative on their own para ipakita din na meron na pong nagbabago sa mga indigenous communities natin. Sa Central Luzon, as far as we are concerned, mahaba pa po ang lalakbayin talaga dito. Sa mga Aita, sa mga Dumagat, doon sa mga so-called Negrito groups, marami pa pong challenges in terms of education, in terms of socio-economic, and even participation in the political space. Marami pa pong dapat gawin para dyan. Though meron tayong IPMR, pero sabi ko din kanina, yung quality ng kanila pong na-deliver as a member of the council or any other council for that matter ay ibang istorya pa. And yung pong sa IP Women, the reason kung bakit namin din ipinupush kasi nga hindi rin pa napapansin, kulang pa talaga, may kinalaman sa gender and development naman. So ayun po, nasa journey pa rin. That is the theme of the 2021 Indigenous Peoples Month, the journey of our indigenous people. So we're still in a journey, and sa ngalan po siguro ng aming pong commission, ng aming mga leaders sa NCIP, we are inviting everyone na makibahagi pa rin po sa paglalakbay, makibahagi po dito sa mga ginagawa po natin. I have AVPs for Project Ipanaw, but I think wala na pong time. But yung pong gusto mag-request, I can send yung pong organizer, sila Ma'am Leia, ng Google link kung saan doon po makikita ninyo lahat yung mga AVPs and presentations na ginamit po today sa forum po natin.
That would be so helpful. Thank you, Sir Kevin. And Ma'am Mai, your final thoughts on IP development and IP rights.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting me here again. I will answer this by addressing one of the questions I think that was posted earlier about whether there is a pattern in developing indigenous competence or citizen competence in general. And I would say that the short answer is yes, there is a pattern. How do we develop citizen competence? We have to start with values, and values are localized. Values are developed locally because these can be expressed and activated by having a face-to-face interaction. So the values that we have learned in school, I suppose, the formal education, pagiging makabayan or makajos, or all these values are quite general, but in reality, in order to develop citizen competence and have civic virtue, we have to start in our community locally. And that's the beauty of studying indigenous peoples in the Cordillera. They have given me so much insight. Apart from that, IPRA, as a law, a comprehensive, multifaceted law, creates the environment where we can actually use the values that we have learned in actual action. So IPRA provides an environment that's conducive for both discourse, debate, and also practical action. And this is actually the key. How do you develop citizen competence? You don't stop at cultivating values, because if these values would not find a place or an event where they can be applied, then the values actually fade. So in indigenous communities and through IPRA, we have seen so many strategies, so many events, so many areas where values get applied into action, such as, for example, when they devise their indigenous political structures, or when they write their indigenous political structure, or when they do their ancestral domain sustainable and protection plan, or when they participate in free and prior informed consent, or when they become indigenous people's mandatory rep, or when they put their indigenous knowledge systems into the curriculum, into formal structures of education, or when they use their ancestral domain for the good of both their local community and the nation. These are all places or arrangements where values will meet action. And that's the whole secret to developing citizen competence. If we only have the values, but we actually don't have the platforms to use these values, then it's problematic. And it's also problematic if we have the platforms, but we do not have the values. So the idea is there is a pattern, but this pattern is unique to every indigenous community. And so the challenge really is not to become frustrated with how IPRA has been implemented over the last 24 years. What we should be is hopeful, because despite all the failings of IPRA, what it has created as a matter of political environment where we can discuss like this, indigenous peoples, non-indigenous peoples, academics, policymakers, students, your average citizen, is actually such a meaningful and great accomplishment for a law that aims to restore the balance and correct some historical injustice that has been done against our indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much, Mamai. I'd like to thank all our speakers again. This was such an insightful session, so interesting. The breadth of experience and knowledge is truly amazing. I had so much fun, and I hope our participants also learned a lot. Again, the evaluation form is in the comments if you need it. I'd like to thank the CSS Lecture Series Committee and the SNO for helping us put it together. We're going to take a lunch break, and then we'll actually be back at 1 for our final session of the conference series. Hopefully you guys can meet us there as well. You can always reach out to us if you would like to learn more about future events. And also, if you missed any, you can check our Facebook page to watch the previous sessions. Thank you again so much. I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you
me.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith, for this, and your co-moderators and assistant moderators in there. I know Verna and Mayumi were actively
working double time. Yeah.
I don't know how to
Thank
react.
you.
Wait, ayun. I'll react. Yeah.
Oh, I know it's a different
Yes.
time for you, Mai, and I
It
know
is. I'm
Hendrik.
actually very hungry.
I know, and I know Hendrix and Kevin have left their work just because of this, and we didn't expect that it's going to be this long. This is the longest panel, I think, the longest session we've had so far. We've never reached 12 in our previous session. So
I'm so sorry. The questions were so interesting.
I
just
know.
thought
They're all so good. Oh my gosh. I'm
Yeah.
like,
No, it's, and we can't just cut it off because the participants were all there. So we cannot just say, oh, we'll just stop at 10. So we're happy that they've engaged and that we're learning from this, and we've learned from you, and we hope that the enthusiasm to work with Indigenous peoples and work on Indigenous studies will continue. So thank you so much. We didn't even ask for a photo with the participants because it's like, oh, medyo nakakahiya na, 12 o'clock na and they're
Yeah.
doing this. But anyway,
Ma'am
yeah.
Caroline commented, that's the IP way, answer until everyone's satisfied.
yes, yes.
We're so
Truly.
happy, and we hope we sustain this kind of conversation. I'm so happy to put this panel in because from the international, and then you have national, and then you have the local, and it's just fascinating how this ties up and how you speakers were able to connect to each other. We didn't expect that too, so it's good. So thank you.
Yeah, this is a
Please
well
go.
put together panel. It's like I was listening and I'm like, okay, I can put that in my thesis, I think. Probably I have a space for another paragraph, so I can put it in.
Happy na po ako kasi naalala po ako ni Ma'am Mai.
Yes, of course. Lahat kayo. Wait, Kit, are you with
Estudyante
UP
ako ng-
Baguio?
Yeah, I'm teaching the SEM. I
Oh
just
my
started.
gosh.
Yeah.
That is
I'm so
yes.
excited to see you again, ma'am. Oh my
Yeah,
god.
oh my, just call me Mai. I'm coming
Okay.
back. I'm coming back in a few months, so you should see me.
Yeah. Now you'll see the age, Mai. You have
I
3
know.
generations of students.
Can't believe it.
Sa kanila pa ako yung pinakamatandad sa panel na estudyante ni Ma'am. Estudyante po niya ako.